In this video, we're going to be talking about the disturbing SpongeBob episode Iceberg. Let's get started with the surface level. Hall Monitor shows us what happens when SpongeBob gets a tiny bit of authority and everything goes completely sideways. SpongeBob finally gets his chance to be Hall Monitor at Mrs. Puff's boating school, something he's clearly been wanting forever. But here's the thing, nobody else wants to do it. Jimmy already did it and is over it. Bill flat out refuses. Tina's done it 3 times and basically tells Mrs. Puff to pick someone else. Even Beth gets mentioned before Mrs. Puff remembers she already graduated. You can see Mrs. Puff getting more desperate as she runs out of options. SpongeBob keeps moving his desk closer like an eager kid trying to get picked for dodgeball, and she's stuck. She knows this won't end well, but what choice does she have? Then SpongeBob gives this acceptance speech that goes on for hours. Literally hours. The clock disappears because so much time passes. He's going on about protecting people and enforcing rules while everyone slowly zones out. By the time he's done, school's over and Mrs. Puff has fallen asleep at her desk. The other students trampled right over him, rushing to get out. Mrs. Puff feels bad and lets him keep the uniform overnight. This turns out to be a terrible decision, but she's too tired to think it through. Here's where things start getting weird. SpongeBob decides being Hall Monitor doesn't stop when school ends, so he takes his job to the streets. His first bright idea is to fix a broken traffic light by directing traffic himself. Picture this, you're driving along and suddenly there's this yellow guy in a uniform doing wild hand gestures in the middle of the road. Cars start crashing into each other because nobody knows what he's trying to tell them. There's this whole pile up with cars stacked on top of each other, and some fish is yelling, "My leg," as he gets hurt in the mess. SpongeBob looks at this disaster scene and congratulates himself. He actually asks, "What would this town do without you, SpongeBob?" while standing next to a bunch of wrecked cars. The guy has zero awareness that he caused all this chaos. He genuinely thinks he helped. But it gets weirder. SpongeBob sees someone's window is open and decides they're in danger, so he puts on a ski mask, crashes through their window and yells, "I'm the open window maniac." These poor people are just eating dinner, and suddenly there's a masked guy in their house talking about being a maniac. They run away screaming while SpongeBob closes their window and acts like he saved the day. The really strange part comes when SpongeBob hears about a maniac causing trouble around town and decides to hunt him down. The twist, he's hunting himself. Patrick becomes his deputy and describes everything the maniac is doing over walkie-talkie, not realizing he's just watching SpongeBob the whole time. SpongeBob starts freaking out, running around in circles, hiding behind buildings, and eventually stuffing himself in a mailbox. When Patrick says the maniac is in the mailbox, SpongeBob bursts out with his arms and legs poking through the metal, completely panicked. He's basically chasing his own tail and doesn't realize it. The chaos peaks when SpongeBob crashes through 4 buildings trying to escape from the maniac. These buildings just topple over one after another. He runs through a fence that's covered in wanted posters with his own picture on it, and still doesn't connect the dots. The police show up with multiple cars and treat SpongeBob like a real criminal, which honestly makes sense given all the destruction. Mrs. Puff arrives, realizes what happened, and takes responsibility. They both get arrested, and the episode ends with Mrs. Puff teaching her class from jail for 6 months. The really unsettling part isn't the destruction itself, it's how SpongeBob never figures out he caused any of it. People probably lost their homes when those buildings collapsed. That fish who hurt his leg might have needed medical help. The couple he's scared will probably have trust issues. But SpongeBob just sits in class at the end, apparently learning nothing and ready to do it all again. Mrs. Puff ends up in prison, while SpongeBob remains completely clueless about the mess he made. The guy caused a multi-car accident, broke into someone's house, destroyed several buildings, and traumatized multiple people, all while thinking he was being helpful. What makes this episode kind of disturbing is how disconnected SpongeBob is from the consequences of his actions. He's so convinced he's doing good that he can't see the obvious pattern of chaos following him around. It's like watching someone who means well but has absolutely no self-awareness, and the results are pretty concerning when you add them all up. What's also weird is how the other characters react to all this. The police don't seem that surprised by the destruction, like this kind of thing happens regularly in Bikini Bottom. The news reporters treat it like just another story. Even the people getting hurt seem to bounce back pretty quickly, which makes you wonder what else goes on in this town that nobody talks about. Mrs. Puff's reaction is probably the most telling. She doesn't seem shocked that SpongeBob caused all this chaos. She seems resigned to it, like she was expecting something bad to happen. When she takes responsibility and goes to jail, there's the sense that she knows this is just part of dealing with SpongeBob. She's probably been through similar situations before, which raises questions about what other incidents we haven't seen. The episode also shows how quickly things can spiral out of control when someone who means well doesn't understand their impact. SpongeBob starts with the simple goal of being a good hall monitor, but each helpful action creates bigger problems. It's like watching a domino effect where good intentions pave the road to disaster. The fact that all this property damage and people getting hurt gets played off as just SpongeBob being SpongeBob is a bit unsettling. Sure, it's a cartoon, but the scale of destruction is actually pretty serious when you think about what would happen in real life. People would be traumatized, homeless, and probably need therapy after dealing with SpongeBob's help. The episode treats massive public safety failures as comedy, which is kind of dark when you step back and look at the bigger picture. Moving on to one of the weirder episodes that gets kind of sad when you think about it. SB-129 takes Squidward on a time travel adventure that starts simple, but ends up being pretty depressing in ways you might not notice as a kid. The whole thing starts because Squidward just wants to practice his clarinet without SpongeBob and Patrick bugging him about jellyfishing. They keep showing up at his door asking the same question over and over. Every time he says no and slams the door, they're back again in like 2 seconds. It's honestly pretty annoying, and you can understand why Squidward gets fed up. So Squidward runs to the Krusty Krab thinking he'll be safe there since it's Sunday and nobody should be around. But SpongeBob and Patrick track him down anyway, still asking about jellyfishing. Squidward gets so desperate that he hides in the walk-in freezer, figuring he'll wait them out until they get bored and leave. The door locks behind him, and Squidward just assumes someone will come looking for him soon. He's probably thinking Mr. Krabs will show up, or maybe someone will need something from the freezer. Then the narrator drops 2,000 years later, and you realize Squidward just lost 2,000 years of his life because he didn't want to go jellyfishing. When a robot SpongeBob finds him frozen solid, Squidward discovers that everyone he knew is dead and the world has completely changed. Everything is chrome now, which sounds cool until you see how cold and sterile it looks. The bikini bottom he remembers is gone, replaced by this metallic world that doesn't feel like home at all. The really sad part is that Spongetron isn't actually SpongeBob. He looks similar and acts friendly, but he's just a robot with none of the original's personality. Same with Patron. These aren't his annoying neighbors anymore. They're just mechanical copies that remind him of what he lost. There are apparently 486 different Spongetron models, which means even individuality got mass-produced. Squidward panics and uses the time machine to go to the past, but that's somehow even worse. The prehistoric versions of SpongeBob and Patrick are basically cavemen who can barely talk. When Squidward tries to teach them jellyfishing, they go completely wild and chase him around like they want to hurt him. It's like his worst nightmare where the people he knows become violent strangers. The weirdest part happens when Squidward breaks the time machine and ends up in this place called Nowhere. It's just white, empty space with nothing in it except him. Voices keep saying alone over and over while the space seems to get smaller. For someone who always said he wanted to be alone, this is basically his wish granted in the worst possible way. Squidward has a breakdown and starts crying, admitting he misses his old life, and even SpongeBob and Patrick. When he finally gets back to his own time, he's clearly been changed by the whole experience. But then he realizes something that makes it even worse. He invented jellyfishing by teaching it to those prehistoric creatures, which means he's responsible for the thing that annoys him in the present. The episode ends with Squidward saying he's going back, suggesting he'd rather deal with time travel weirdness than face his normal problems. That's pretty concerning when you think about it. He's basically choosing to run away from his life, rather than deal with minor annoyances. What makes this episode kind of disturbing is how it shows what happens when you get exactly what you ask for. Squidward always complained about wanting to be left alone, but when he actually gets complete solitude, it makes him miserable. The episode is basically saying that even annoying friends are better than no friends at all. There's also something depressing about how Squidward's small decision to hide in a freezer ends up costing him everything. He just wanted a few minutes of peace to practice clarinet, but it resulted in losing his entire world. Everyone he knew died while he was frozen, and he can never get that time back. The time travel stuff creates this weird situation where Squidward is stuck in a loop he created himself. He taught jellyfishing to the past, which means it exists in his present, which annoys him enough to time travel, which leads to him teaching it in the past. There's no way to fix it without creating more problems. The robot versions of his friends are probably the most unsettling part. They look right and act friendly, but they're not real. It's like being surrounded by really good actors pretending to be people you care about. You know something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on what's wrong. The episode treats all this time travel chaos as comedy, but there's something genuinely sad about Squidward's situation. He loses everything because he wanted a few minutes of quiet time and then discovers he's trapped in a cycle of his own making. The fact that he considers going back to the time travel nightmare rather than dealing with his present life suggests the whole experience really messed with his head. It's one of those episodes that seems fun and silly on the surface, but has some pretty heavy implications when you think about it too much. Squidward basically experiences loss and isolation in ways that would be traumatic for anyone, and the show plays it for laughs. Now let's talk about the episode where SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs make a really gross burger and things get out of hand. Nasty Patty is one of those episodes that seems normal until you think about what's actually happening, and then it gets a bit weird. The whole thing starts when a health inspector shows up at the Krusty Krab during a storm. Mr. Krabs freaks out because he knows one bad inspection could shut down his restaurant. So he and SpongeBob go into overdrive, trying to impress this guy, basically shoving every menu item down his throat. The inspector can barely breathe between all the food they're cramming into his mouth. Everything seems fine until a news report comes on saying there's a fake health inspector going around getting free food from restaurants. Mr. Krabs loses his mind when he realizes they've been feeding this guy for free. His reaction is pretty intense, with his eyes turning red and everything getting all dramatic. You can tell he's genuinely angry about being scammed. Here's where things get weird. Instead of just being annoyed about the wasted food, Mr. Krabs decides to get revenge by making the grossest burger possible. He actually wants to make the guy sick as payback. SpongeBob goes along with it, which is pretty out of character for someone who's usually so innocent. They start making what they call the Nasty Patty. Mr. Krabs adds volcano sauce, SpongeBob puts in seahorse radish that he calls the gnarliest stuff in the ocean, and then Mr. Krabs fetches toenail clippings from his office. Actual toenail clippings that he wants to put on food, which is honestly pretty disgusting. Then SpongeBob accidentally drops the whole thing in the toilet. Instead of starting over like normal people would, Mr. Krabs suggests drying it off with his gym socks. So now they've got this burger that's been in the toilet and dried with dirty socks, plus all the gross stuff they already added. It looks absolutely revolting, with green meat and a pimpled bun. The really weird part is how much fun they're having while making this thing. They're giggling and wearing clothespins on their noses like it's some kind of fun science experiment instead of them trying to make someone sick. It's pretty out of character for both of them to be enjoying the idea of hurting someone. When the inspector starts to eat the burger, a fly buzzes into his throat and he starts choking. He slips on some condiment packets and hits his head, knocking himself out. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs see this and think their gross burger actually killed the guy. Instead of being horrified, they start celebrating like their plan worked. Then it hits them that they might have actually killed someone. Instead of calling for help or checking if he's okay, they immediately start worrying about getting in trouble. Mr. Krabs starts blaming SpongeBob for the whole thing, even though it was his idea. They decide they need to hide the body before anyone finds out what happened. They drag the unconscious inspector out to some remote spot and start digging what they think is a grave. SpongeBob is freaking out about touching what he thinks is a dead person, while Mr. Krabs is just focused on covering up their mistake. When they accidentally hit the guy with a rock and he groans, they don't realize he's still alive and just bury him deeper. When police show up looking for someone else entirely, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs think they're being investigated for murder. They start acting super suspicious and hiding the inspector in weird places around the restaurant. When one cop wants ice from the freezer where they've hidden him, they panic completely. Instead of continuing to lie, they just confess to killing someone. Mr. Krabs immediately blames SpongeBob while SpongeBob starts revealing embarrassing things about Mr. Krabs. Their friendship falls apart instantly when they think they're going to get arrested. The inspector finally wakes up and it turns out he was just unconscious the whole time, but the police think he's a zombie and start hitting him with random objects. The poor guy ends up getting beaten up by the people who are supposed to help him. The episode ends with everything going back to normal. The inspector gives them a passing grade and everyone acts like nothing weird happened. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs are celebrating while the inspector crawls away, probably confused about what just happened to him. What makes this episode kind of disturbing is how quickly things escalated. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs went from wanting to impress a customer to actively trying to make him sick in just a few minutes. They got so caught up in their anger about being scammed that they completely forgot about being decent people. It's also weird seeing SpongeBob go along with making someone sick. Usually he's the moral center who keeps everyone else from doing bad things, but here he's actively participating in the revenge plot. He even seems to enjoy making the gross burger, which is pretty unlike him. The cover-up part is strange too. Instead of doing the right thing when they think someone is hurt, their first instinct is to protect themselves. They're more worried about getting in trouble than about whether someone is actually dead. That's a pretty dark turn for characters who are usually portrayed as basically good people. The episode treats attempted food poisoning and covering up what they think is a death as just another wacky SpongeBob adventure. Nobody really faces consequences for anything that happened, and everything goes back to normal by the end. It's one of those episodes that seems innocent enough until you really think about what the characters were trying to do to another person. There's something unsettling about how easily they justified hurting someone just because that person scammed them. The punishment they had in mind was way worse than the crime, but they didn't seem to think about that at all. They just wanted revenge and didn't care about the consequences until they thought they'd gone too far. Now let's talk about the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick become entrepreneurs and accidentally turn into scam artists. Chocolate with Nuts starts innocent enough but shows how easily good intentions can get twisted when money gets involved. The whole thing begins when SpongeBob gets a fancy magazine in the mail by mistake. He and Patrick flip through it and see all these rich people living luxurious lives. There's a guy with a swimming pool inside his swimming pool, and Patrick gets excited about someone who has shoes. They decide they want that kind of lifestyle and figure they need to become entrepreneurs to get rich. SpongeBob asks Patrick what he'd want most in the world, and Patrick says chocolate. So they decide to become traveling chocolate salesmen, which seems like a perfectly innocent business idea. They buy a bunch of chocolate bars and head out to make their fortune. Their first customer is this guy who seems normal until SpongeBob mentions chocolate. Then he completely loses his mind, screaming, "Chocolate, chocolate, chocolate," and chasing them around town like some kind of maniac. It's actually pretty scary how obsessed this guy is, and SpongeBob and Patrick spend the whole episode running from him. Things get weird when they meet a guy who sells them special bags for carrying chocolate bars. He convinces them that no self-respecting salesman would be caught without these bags, and they end up buying way too many. Then he sells them bags to carry the bags. It's obvious he's taking advantage of them, but SpongeBob and Patrick are too naive to realize they're being scammed. The really strange part comes when they start having trouble making sales because they can't find their chocolate in all the bags. An old lady wants to buy some but gets impatient and leaves while they're still digging around. That's when they realize they need a new approach. SpongeBob suggests they try being nicer to customers, but Patrick takes it way too far. When they knock on the next door, Patrick immediately tells the guy, "I love you," which obviously freaks him out. SpongeBob tries a more normal approach, but that doesn't work either because the customer is worried about chocolate having sugar and turning into bubbling fat. After a bunch of failed attempts, they decide to start stretching the truth to make sales. This is where things get questionable. Instead of just being honest about what chocolate is, they start making up wild claims about what it can do. They tell people chocolate will make them live forever, which is a pretty messed up thing to lie about. An elderly woman in a wheelchair immediately wants to buy some because she's desperate to extend her life. Her daughter clearly doesn't want her to waste money on this nonsense, but the old lady is so hopeful that she buys it anyway. Watching SpongeBob and Patrick take advantage of someone's fear of death is pretty uncomfortable. But they don't stop there. They tell another customer that chocolate will make his hair grow, and he buys 20 bars because his wife is trying to grow a beard. They claim it'll make people sound smart, and some guy with a southern accent immediately wants multiple bars. Each lie gets more ridiculous, but people keep believing them. Patrick tells someone chocolate will keep their face from getting uglier, which is just mean. SpongeBob claims it'll make people fly, fall in love, bring world peace, and even let them rule the world. These aren't little white lies anymore. They're taking people's money based on completely made-up benefits. The weirdest customer they encounter is this guy who's covered in bandages and claims to have glass bones and paper skin. He says he breaks his legs every morning and his arms every afternoon and lies awake in agony until heart attacks put him to sleep. It's genuinely sad listening to this guy describe his condition, and then he falls down his stairs and breaks even more bones. SpongeBob and Patrick feel bad and help him into his house, where he reveals that he pays for his medical bills by selling chocolate. They end up buying all his chocolate instead of selling their own, which completely defeats the purpose of their business. The guy turns out to be another scammer who was just wearing a costume, but they don't find that out until later. By the end, SpongeBob and Patrick have given up on selling chocolate and are sitting in the street feeling like failures. That's when the crazy chocolate-obsessed guy from the beginning finally catches up to them. Instead of hurting them like they expected, he wants to buy all their chocolate and gives them a huge pile of money. They use their new wealth to rent out an entire fancy restaurant and take the old lady and her daughter on a date. The old lady is still trying to rub chocolate on herself because they told her it would make her live forever, while her daughter glares at them with obvious hatred. They got what they wanted, but only by lying to desperate people. What makes this episode kind of disturbing is how easily SpongeBob and Patrick justify their lies. They start with good intentions, but quickly discover that telling the truth doesn't make money. So they switch to making up increasingly wild claims about chocolate, and each successful lie makes the next one easier to tell. It's particularly uncomfortable watching them target vulnerable people. The elderly woman who's afraid of dying, the guy who's insecure about his appearance, people who are desperate enough to believe that chocolate can solve their problems. SpongeBob and Patrick don't seem to feel bad about taking advantage of these people's hopes and fears. The episode also shows how being scammed can turn you into a scammer. The bag salesman tricks them into buying useless products, and then they turn around and trick other people into buying chocolate based on false promises. It's like a cycle where everyone's trying to take advantage of everyone else. By the end, SpongeBob and Patrick have learned that lying is more profitable than honesty. But the episode doesn't really address whether that's a good thing or not. They achieve their dream of fancy living, but only through deception and exploitation. The people they lied to are probably going to be disappointed when chocolate doesn't actually make them live forever or rule the world. There's something unsettling about how the episode treats consumer fraud as just another way to make money. SpongeBob and Patrick face no consequences for their lies and seem to have learned that success requires abandoning honesty. It's one of those episodes where the main characters kind of become the bad guys without really realizing it. Now let's move deeper into our iceberg, the shallow waters. But before that, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Let's get started with an episode that shows Squidward discovering something he actually enjoys, but maybe getting a little too into it. Just one bite takes Squidward from his usual grumpy complaints about Krabby Patties to becoming their biggest fan in a pretty short amount of time. The whole thing starts with Squidward doing his typical job at the Krusty Krab, serving customers while constantly complaining about how disgusting Krabby Patties are. He's watching Harold eat one and making comments about how gross it is, calling the customers sickening for eating that garbage. When SpongeBob hears this, he thinks Squidward is joking because everyone loves Krabby Patties. But Squidward doubles down and admits he's never actually tried one and never will. SpongeBob is genuinely shocked by this revelation. He literally takes out a dictionary to see if it's possible to use those words in the same sentence. The customers in the restaurant have this saying, "The only people who don't like a Krabby Patty have never tasted one." So SpongeBob becomes determined to get Squidward to try just one bite, convinced it'll change his mind completely. The build-up to Squidward's first taste gets pretty intense as SpongeBob refuses to give up. He follows Squidward around the restaurant with a patty, trying every trick he can think of. He does the airplane thing with babies, pulls patties out from behind Squidward's ear like magic tricks, and even follows him into the bathroom. When none of that works, SpongeBob gets desperate and handcuffs himself to Squidward, showing just how determined he is to prove his point. Here's where things get interesting. Squidward finally gives in and takes a tiny bite just to get SpongeBob to leave him alone. But instead of admitting he likes it, he puts on this huge performance about how terrible it is. He calls it horrible, putrid, and disgusting, then throws it on the ground and stomps on it while cursing everyone who enjoys them. He even puts a little tombstone on the crushed burger like he's holding a funeral. The really weird part comes after SpongeBob goes back inside. The second he's alone, Squidward completely changes. He starts desperately digging through the dirt where he buried the burger, talking to it like it's alive. When he finds it covered in sand, he shoves the whole thing in his mouth and starts crying about all the wasted years. It's like watching someone discover their new favorite thing, but in a way that's kind of uncomfortable. What happens next shows how quickly Squidward's new obsession takes over. He sneaks around to the back of the Krusty Krab and tries to order a burger from SpongeBob, getting more and more excited as he describes what he wants. His eyes literally follow the patty as SpongeBob flips it, and when steam from the grill touches his face, he acts like it's the best thing ever. But when SpongeBob walks away with the burger to find the customer who ordered it, Squidward looks genuinely distressed. Things get weirder when SpongeBob can't find who ordered the burger and decides to eat it himself. Squidward watches in horror as his chance for another taste disappears. He gets so desperate that he actually considers eating one out of the garbage. And when he sees someone throw away a half-eaten patty, he goes for it. He ends up eating a bunch of trash just to get to that one burger, which is pretty gross when you think about it. That night, Squidward has these elaborate dreams about Krabby Patties where he marries one and grows old with it. When he wakes up, he's so focused on getting more that he decides to break into the Krusty Krab in the middle of the night. The restaurant has some kind of security system that sets him on fire twice, but he just walks it off like it's no big deal. The immediate aftermath gets pretty wild when Squidward finally reaches the patty vault. He opens it to find hundreds of Krabby Patties and doesn't know where to start. When SpongeBob shows up at 3 a.m. to count sesame seeds, he catches Squidward red-handed. Squidward tries to lie his way out of it, but he's obviously been caught stealing food from his workplace. When SpongeBob finally gets him to admit he likes Krabby Patties, Squidward completely loses control. He starts eating burger after burger in increasingly frantic ways, shoving multiple ones in his mouth and even diving into the pile like it's a swimming pool. SpongeBob tries to warn him that eating that many at once isn't a good idea, but Squidward asks what's going to happen. Will he blow up? The episode ends with exactly that happening. Squidward's thighs expand to massive proportions, and then the whole Krusty Krab explodes. In the ambulance, his head is sitting on a bench while his tentacles are in a bucket, and the paramedic just laughs and says he remembers his first Krabby Patty. It's played for laughs, but Squidward basically ended up in the hospital because he couldn't control himself. What makes this episode a bit unsettling is how quickly Squidward goes from complete disinterest to total obsession. One bite changed his entire personality and made him willing to lie, steal, and ignore obvious warning signs about his behavior. The transformation from someone who called the food garbage to someone breaking into buildings to get more is pretty dramatic. The episode also shows how people can get really into things once they discover them, sometimes to an unhealthy degree. Squidward went from never trying something to being willing to break the law and ignore his safety just to get more of it. While it's supposed to be funny, there's something kind of concerning about how extreme his behavior gets so quickly. There's also something weird about how everyone else reacts to Squidward's situation. SpongeBob seems more concerned about proper eating techniques than about his coworker's obvious breakdown. The paramedic treats Squidward's condition like it's normal rather than a serious problem. Nobody seems to think it's strange that someone went from hating something to destroying their life over it in less than 24 hours. Moving on to an episode that shows what happens when SpongeBob finds a new pet and refuses to listen to anyone's advice about it. My Pretty Seahorse starts innocent enough with SpongeBob discovering a wild seahorse, quickly turns into a story about ignoring obvious problems until they become disasters. The whole thing begins during springtime in Bikini Bottom when SpongeBob is doing some gardening outside his house. He's trying to be nice to Squidward by planting hypoallergenic flowers for his hay fever, but every time he turns around to get his watering can, something keeps eating the flowers. After watching for 3 days straight until his eyes shrivel up, SpongeBob finally spots the culprit, a wild seahorse that's been munching on everything in sight. Instead of being annoyed about his destroyed garden, SpongeBob immediately falls in love with the seahorse. He starts imagining himself riding around with flowing hair like some kind of underwater cowboy. He decides to name her Mystery because of her mysterious behavior, though her behavior isn't really that mysterious since she's just eating everything she can find. SpongeBob spends the day bonding with his new pet, riding around town, going shopping, and even letting her sleep in his bed while he sleeps on the floor. The build-up to disaster starts when SpongeBob brings Mystery to work and ties her up outside the Krusty Krab like she's a bicycle. This is where things start going wrong pretty quickly. Some customers see her and think she's a kiddie ride, so one guy tries to put a quarter in what he thinks is a coin slot. Mystery doesn't appreciate this and launches him into the background where he explodes. The other customer runs away screaming about a kiddie ride being on the loose. Mr. Krabs comes outside to see what's causing the commotion and immediately identifies Mystery as a monster scaring away customers. When SpongeBob explains that she's his friend, Mr. Krabs gives him an ultimatum. It's either SpongeBob or the horse. SpongeBob pretends to get rid of Mystery, but actually hides her in a kitchen cabinet, thinking he can keep her secret until Patrick builds a stable for her. Patrick, meanwhile, is just sitting around with a board on his head doing absolutely nothing. The main event kicks off when Mystery gets hungry and starts causing chaos from inside her hiding spot. She eats a Krabby Patty and neighs loudly, almost giving away her location. When Mr. Krabs comes in asking about the noise, SpongeBob has to improvise by making his own horse sounds, which are terrible. Things escalate when Mystery starts eating orders off the serving window, leaving customers confused about their missing food. SpongeBob tries to explain this as ghosts, which makes him panic even more. The situation spirals completely out of control when Mystery's appetite takes over. She eats SpongeBob's hat, his spatula, all the Krabby Patties, the stove, and somehow even manages to eat Old Man Jenkins, who ends up talking from inside her belly saying he doesn't want to be a burden. The customers are getting angry about their missing food, and Squidward suggests they go somewhere more family-oriented, causing everyone to leave. The immediate aftermath comes when Mr. Krabs discovers what's been happening in his kitchen. He finds SpongeBob giving Mystery bicarbonate of soda for her bellyache from eating too much, and Old Man Jenkins gets burped back up asking what he missed. Mr. Krabs is furious that SpongeBob disobeyed his direct order and still has the horse after being told to get rid of it. SpongeBob makes this emotional speech about how Mystery is more than just a horse. He talks about how she listens to him, understands everything he says, and how they're best friends. He even lifts up his shirt to show their hearts beating together, which is genuinely weird and makes Squidward scream. Mr. Krabs seems touched by this and shares his own story about losing his first dime, which he loved like a brother until he spent it on a soda. The episode takes a turn when Mr. Krabs explains that sometimes you have to let things go even when it's hard. He points out that Mystery misses the outdoors, and the kitchen is no place for a wild animal. SpongeBob realizes he's being selfish and decides to set Mystery free. He takes her outside, removes her leash, and tells her she belongs in the wild. When she doesn't leave immediately, he starts yelling at her, calling her a stupid dumb animal just to make her go away. But here's where the real problem reveals itself. After Mystery gallops away and Mr. Krabs is consoling SpongeBob about doing the right thing, Squidward discovers that the horse has eaten through the vault and devoured a bunch of Mr. Krabs' money. Suddenly, Mr. Krabs changes his tune completely and starts chasing after Mystery with SpongeBob, desperate to get his money back. The long-term repercussions show how SpongeBob's refusal to listen to good advice led to serious consequences. Mystery caused customers to leave the restaurant, ate a person, destroyed kitchen equipment, and cost Mr. Krabs a significant amount of money. All of this could have been avoided if SpongeBob had just accepted that a wild seahorse doesn't belong in a restaurant kitchen. What makes this episode somewhat disturbing is how SpongeBob's good intentions lead to so much chaos. He genuinely loves Mystery and wants to take care of her, but his inability to recognize that she's a wild animal with different needs causes problems for everyone around him. He puts his emotional attachment above practical concerns and other people's well-being. The episode also shows how quickly a situation can get out of hand when someone ignores obvious warning signs. Mystery was eating everything from the moment SpongeBob met her, but he chose to see this as cute rather than problematic. When she started causing trouble at work, he decided to hide the problem instead of addressing it. There's something unsettling about how SpongeBob lies to his boss and puts his job at risk for a pet he's known for less than a week. Mr. Krabs' anger is completely justified since Mystery cost him customers and money, but SpongeBob acts like he's being unreasonable. The fact that SpongeBob only agrees to let Mystery go after Mr. Krabs gives him an emotional speech shows he wasn't really considering what was best for the animal. The ending where they're all chasing Mystery to get the money back kind of undermines the whole message about letting wild animals be free. It suggests that the only real problem was the financial cost, not the fact that keeping a wild seahorse in a kitchen was always a bad idea that was bound to end badly. Now let's talk about the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick discover swear words and accidentally teach kids everywhere about the power of bad language. Sailor Mouth starts with innocent curiosity, but quickly shows how language can get you in serious trouble when you don't understand what you're actually saying. The whole thing begins when SpongeBob is taking out the trash and discovers graffiti written on the dumpster behind the Krusty Krab. He starts reading the messages like "up with bubbles, down with air," and "nematodes are people too," treating it like harmless fun. Then he finds one that says "Squidward smells," and helpfully adds the word "good" to make it nicer. But then he comes across another piece of graffiti that just says "crabs is A," followed by a word that gets censored by a dolphin sound. When the garbage man hears SpongeBob say this word, he's clearly disgusted and asks if SpongeBob kisses his mother with that mouth. SpongeBob doesn't understand what the problem is since he was just reading what someone else wrote. Patrick shows up and explains that the word is a sentence enhancer that you sprinkle into conversation to make yourself sound fancy and sophisticated. He demonstrates by using it in casual conversation, and both of them start incorporating it into their speech. The build-up to disaster happens when SpongeBob goes to work the next day and starts using his new fancy word with customers. He greets people by saying what a nice dolphin sound day they're having and announces the daily special using multiple censored words. The customers are shocked and horrified by what they're hearing. Parents try to cover their children's ears, and everyone starts complaining about the foul language coming from what's supposed to be a family restaurant. The main event unfolds when all the customers get so offended that they leave the restaurant in disgust. The customer satisfaction meter starts dropping, alarms go off, and Mr. Krabs realizes his business is in serious trouble. When he finds out what happened, he explains to SpongeBob and Patrick that what they've been saying is actually bad word number 11 out of 13 total bad words that sailors know about. The boys are horrified to learn they've been saying something inappropriate and promise never to use that language again. Later that day, SpongeBob and Patrick are playing a board game called Eels and Escalators when SpongeBob gets frustrated and accidentally says the bad word again. Patrick threatens to tell Mr. Krabs, but then he says it too while trying to explain what SpongeBob did wrong. They end up racing to the Krusty Krab to tattle on each other, both pointing fingers and saying the word repeatedly while trying to get the other one in trouble. Things get worse when Mr. Krabs lectures them about using bad language, but then he stubs his foot on a rock and unleashes a string of swear words that make SpongeBob and Patrick's vocabulary look tame. He uses all 13 bad words while hopping around in pain, with the show censoring everything with boat horns, seagull sounds, and other nautical noises. SpongeBob and Patrick count each word and decide they need to tell his mother about his foul language. The immediate aftermath involves all three of them going to Mr. Krabs' mother's house, where they all start explaining what happened while using the censored words extensively. Mama Krabs faints from shock at hearing such language, and Mr. Krabs blames SpongeBob and Patrick for corrupting an innocent old lady with their sailor talk. As punishment, she makes them paint her house while she goes inside to make lemonade. The episode ends with a twist when Mama Krabs stubs her own foot and lets out what sounds like a swear word, causing everyone to gasp in shock. But it turns out she was just reacting to Old Man Jenkins driving by and honking his car horn, which happened to sound like profanity. Everyone laughs when they realize the misunderstanding, and the episode concludes with the lesson that context matters when it comes to language. What makes this episode a bit concerning is how it deals with the topic of inappropriate language in a kid's show. While the actual swear words are censored, the episode basically teaches children that bad words exist, and that using them can get you in trouble. Some parents probably weren't thrilled about having to explain why certain words are inappropriate after their kids watch this episode. The episode also shows how easily misunderstandings can spread when people don't fully understand what they're saying. SpongeBob and Patrick had no idea they were being offensive, which led to them using bad language in front of customers and children. Their ignorance didn't make the impact any less harmful to Mr. Krabs' business or the people who heard them. There's something uncomfortable about watching SpongeBob and Patrick get excited about using fancy language without realizing they're actually being crude. The fact that they think swearing makes them sound sophisticated shows how easily people can be misled about what's considered appropriate behavior. Patrick's explanation about sentence enhancers is completely wrong, but SpongeBob trusts his friend's advice. The episode also highlights the hypocrisy that sometimes exists around bad language. Mr. Krabs gets angry at SpongeBob and Patrick for swearing, but then he uses much worse language when he gets hurt. The boys point this out by threatening to tell his mother, showing that adults don't always follow the rules they expect children to follow. The ending with Mama Krabs accidentally seeming to swear adds another layer to the confusion about what language is actually inappropriate. The fact that everyone initially thinks she's cursing shows how context and perception can affect how we interpret what people are saying. It's a reminder that language is complicated and misunderstandings happen easily. Next up, we have an episode that deals with comedy, bullying, and how jokes can hurt people even when you don't mean them to. Squirrel Jokes shows SpongeBob getting his first taste of success as a comedian, but learning that popularity sometimes comes at the cost of your friendships. The whole thing starts when Mr. Krabs decides to turn the Krusty Krab into a comedy club for the night. SpongeBob gets a chance to perform, but his first attempt at stand-up goes terribly. He tries telling jokes about salt shakers and tomatoes, but nobody laughs. The crowd starts booing and heckling him, with one guy even making fun of his act. SpongeBob is bombing so badly that even Patrick, his best friend, starts booing along with everyone else. In desperation, SpongeBob looks around for material and notices Sandy's big front teeth. He makes a joke about how you could land a plane on them, and suddenly, the crowd starts laughing. Encouraged by this response, He keeps going with more jokes about squirrels having fleas and smelling bad because they spend months buried in dirt. The audience loves it, and SpongeBob finally gets the positive reaction he was looking for. The build-up to the real problem starts when Mr. Krabs sees how successful the squirrel jokes are and decides to make SpongeBob the headliner for future comedy nights. SpongeBob is thrilled about his newfound success, and doesn't really think about how his jokes might be affecting Sandy. When she approaches him after the show to tell him the jokes are hurtful, he brushes off her concerns by saying he was just joking, and that everyone knows she's actually the smartest person in Bikini Bottom. The main issue becomes clear when Sandy starts experiencing the real-world effects of SpongeBob's comedy routine. People at the bargain mart start treating her differently, making comments about her smell and calling her stupid. Kids make fun of her, and their parents warn them not to get too close or they'll catch her stupid. Sandy realizes that SpongeBob's jokes have changed how the entire town sees her, turning her from a respected scientist into a target for mockery. Sandy goes back to SpongeBob and asks him to stop telling squirrel jokes, explaining how people have been treating her since his performance. She's clearly hurt and frustrated, but SpongeBob doesn't take her seriously. When Patrick shows up and talks to her like she's mentally challenged, saying words slowly and treating her like an animal, it becomes obvious that the jokes have spread beyond the comedy club and are affecting Sandy's daily life. Things get worse during SpongeBob's second performance when the crowd demands more squirrel jokes. SpongeBob tries to tell other types of jokes, but the audience isn't interested. They start chanting for squirrel jokes, and SpongeBob faces a choice between his friendship with Sandy and his success as a comedian. Unfortunately, he chooses the comedy career and puts on fake hillbilly teeth to really lean into the stereotypes. The episode takes a dark turn when SpongeBob puts Sandy in the spotlight and tells the audience they're laughing with her, not at her. But it's obvious that everyone is definitely laughing at Sandy, not with her. SpongeBob asks if she understands what's going on, and Sandy responds with a deadpan, "I understand exactly what's going on," showing that she's fully aware of how she's being humiliated, but feels powerless to stop it. The immediate aftermath comes when Sandy leaves SpongeBob a note inviting him to her tree dome to celebrate his success. When SpongeBob shows up with flowers, he finds Sandy dressed like a hillbilly stereotype with flies buzzing around her. She's playing up every negative stereotype about squirrels, acting dumb and talking in an exaggerated accent. She glues SpongeBob to a chair and starts helping him by taking away his water helmet and connecting him to increasingly powerful water sources. Sandy's revenge gets pretty intense as she forces SpongeBob to experience what it's like to be on the receiving end of harmful treatment. She acts like she's too stupid to remember that sea creatures need water, nearly drowning him while maintaining the dumb squirrel act. SpongeBob finally gets the message and agrees to stop telling squirrel jokes, but only after experiencing firsthand how it feels to be treated badly because of stereotypes. The episode ends with SpongeBob's next comedy performance where he starts making fun of squirrels again, but then switches to making jokes about sponges, crabs, fish, and starfish instead. The crowd laughs at jokes about all different types of sea creatures, showing that comedy doesn't have to target just one group. Sandy gives him a thumbs up, indicating that she's okay with this approach since it's not singling her out. What makes this episode somewhat troubling is how it shows how quickly harmful stereotypes can spread through a community. SpongeBob's jokes weren't just entertainment, they actually changed how people treated Sandy in real life. Kids learned to mock her, adults avoided her, and she went from being respected to being seen as a joke. The power of comedy to influence people's attitudes is pretty significant. The episode also deals with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes success comes at other people's expense. SpongeBob had to choose between being popular and being a good friend, and initially he chose popularity. It's only when Sandy forces him to experience similar treatment that he understands how hurtful his jokes really were. There's something disturbing about how quickly the town turned on Sandy based on comedy routines. People who probably respected her before suddenly started treating her like she was actually stupid and smelly just because a comedian made jokes about squirrels. It shows how easily prejudice can spread when it's packaged as humor. The episode raises questions about whether certain types of comedy are ever okay, even if they're meant to be harmless fun. SpongeBob genuinely didn't mean to hurt Sandy, but the impact of his jokes was real regardless of his intentions. The fact that Sandy had to resort to basically torturing SpongeBob to get him to understand the problem shows how difficult it can be to get people to take this kind of harm seriously. Now let's talk about an episode that shows what happens when workplace accusations destroy someone's life and how good intentions can turn into enabling bad behavior. Can You Spare a Dime starts with a simple misunderstanding but escalates into a story about homelessness, exploitation, and how quickly someone's life can fall apart. The whole thing begins at closing time at the Krusty Krab when Mr. Krabs is counting his daily earnings. Everything seems normal until he realizes his special first dime is missing from the back of the cash register. This is his lucky charm that he always keeps there, the very first dime he ever made in business. When he can't find it, he immediately becomes suspicious of Squidward, who's been working the register all day. Mr. Krabs starts interrogating Squidward in increasingly aggressive ways. He asks if Squidward would be willing to swear on a stack of interpretive dance quarterlies, then pulls out a lie detector test. When Squidward asks what he's implying, Mr. Krabs lists 3 possibilities for what happened. Squidward stole it, or Squidward stole it. He demands to see Squidward's tentacles to check for empty suction cups, essentially treating his employee like a criminal. The build-up to disaster happens when Squidward gets fed up with the accusations and quits his job in anger. He throws down his hat and tells Mr. Krabs he's leaving, saying the only mistake he ever made was wasting his life at the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob tries to convince him to stay, warning him that it's a cold world out there, but Squidward is determined to prove he can succeed on his own. He talks about unlocking his potential and becoming anything he sets his mind to. The main event shows just how wrong Squidward was about his prospects. The episode cuts to him sitting homeless in a cardboard box, trying to get spare change from people walking by. When SpongeBob finds him, Squidward is clearly embarrassed about his situation. He's lost his job, his home, and everything he owned. He even had to eat his paintings because nobody would take them, and you can see the rectangular shape in his stomach from the consumed artwork. SpongeBob offers to let Squidward stay with him, and what follows is a montage of SpongeBob taking care of Squidward like he's an invalid. SpongeBob feeds him, massages him, gives him facials, and basically waits on him hand and foot. At first this seems sweet, with Squidward saying he'll try not to be a burden and that it's just temporary until he gets back on his feet. But as time goes on, it becomes clear that Squidward has no intention of looking for work. The situation gets progressively worse as months pass and Squidward becomes completely dependent on SpongeBob's care. He starts making increasingly ridiculous demands, like wanting lemonade remade because it has an odd number of lemon seeds. When SpongeBob brings him alphabet soup that spells out, "Get a job," Squidward slaps it away and complains about condensed soup from a can. He also claims to be allergic to newsprint when SpongeBob tries to show him job listings. The immediate aftermath of this arrangement shows SpongeBob becoming exhausted and resentful, while Squidward gets more entitled and demanding. SpongeBob starts making passive-aggressive comments and even creates a puppet show trying to hint that Squidward should get a job. But Squidward is so comfortable being taken care of that he doesn't pick up on any of the hints. He just keeps making more demands while SpongeBob becomes increasingly frustrated. Things finally explode when SpongeBob reaches his breaking point and literally throws Squidward out of his house while he's still in bed. SpongeBob drags the bed all the way to the Krusty Krab and demands that Mr. Krabs hire Squidward back. When Mr. Krabs refuses, SpongeBob starts throwing dimes at him and eventually grabs him by the throat, screaming about how Squidward has been driving him crazy. In his rage, he shakes Mr. Krabs so violently that the missing dime falls out of Mr. Krabs' own pocket. The episode ends with Squidward getting his job back, but then Mr. Krabs immediately starts accusing him again of putting the dime in his pocket in the first place. Even though it's obvious that Mr. Krabs simply misplaced his own dime, he still can't admit he was wrong. Squidward realizes he's back to the same toxic workplace situation that caused all his problems in the first place, and SpongeBob puts his maid costume back on, knowing this cycle is gonna repeat. What makes this episode disturbing is how it shows how quickly someone's life can be destroyed by false accusations. Squidward went from having a stable job and home to being homeless and begging for change, all because his boss wrongly accused him of theft. The fact that Mr. Krabs never apologizes or admits fault makes it even worse, since Squidward's suffering was completely unnecessary. The episode also deals with the uncomfortable reality of how people can take advantage of kindness. Squidward starts out genuinely grateful for SpongeBob's help, but quickly becomes entitled and demanding. He stops looking for work and just expects SpongeBob to take care of him indefinitely. What began as temporary assistance becomes long-term exploitation. There's something unsettling about how SpongeBob enables Squidward's dependency instead of encouraging him to become self-sufficient. While SpongeBob's kindness is admirable, his inability to set boundaries allows Squidward to become completely reliant on him. The fact that SpongeBob has to reach a violent breaking point before anything changes shows how unhealthy the situation became. The workplace dynamics are also pretty toxic when you think about them. Mr. Krabs immediately assumes his employee is a thief based on no evidence, then refuses to admit he was wrong even when the truth comes out. The fact that he goes right back to making accusations at the end suggests this is a pattern of behavior that will continue to cause problems. The episode shows how economic insecurity can happen to anyone and how difficult it can be to recover once you've lost your job and home. Squidward's fall from employed cashier to homeless beggar happens very quickly, illustrating how precarious many people's financial situations really are. The fact that he had to eat his artwork to survive adds an extra layer of sadness to his situation. Finally, let's wrap up with an episode that deals with academic pressure and the very relatable struggle of putting things off until the last minute. Procrastination follows SpongeBob as he tries to write a simple essay, but keeps finding excuses to avoid actually doing the work, leading to some genuinely stressful moments. The whole thing starts in Mrs. Puff's boating school when she assigns the class an 800-word essay about what not to do at a stoplight. While the other students groan about having homework, SpongeBob is genuinely excited about the assignment. He's practically bouncing in his seat, telling his classmate about how great it is that they get to write about stoplights. Mrs. Puff gives them until the next day to complete it, warning the class to work hard and not goof off. SpongeBob goes home full of enthusiasm and sets up his workspace with paper and a perfectly sharpened pencil. He talks about how this will be the greatest essay of all time, and even kisses his pencil before getting started. He manages to write the title and his name pretty easily, but then something weird happens. Hours pass and he's still stuck on those same few words, unable to write anything else. The build-up to his procrastination spiral begins when SpongeBob notices how beautiful it is outside and sees Patrick and Sandy having fun at the beach. He starts making excuses about why he can't write, saying it should be against the law to have to work on such a nice day. Instead of pushing through, he decides he needs to get his blood pumping and starts doing exercises. Then he notices his chair squeaks and spends time playing with that instead. The main procrastination disaster unfolds as SpongeBob finds increasingly ridiculous ways to avoid writing. He decides Gary needs to be fed and fills his bowl to the ceiling. Then he notices the kitchen is messy and spends hours cleaning every surface until it's sparkling chrome. When he finally sits back down, he spends ages writing just the word "the" in fancy lettering, then immediately declares it's break time. Things get more desperate as SpongeBob starts calling Patrick in the middle of the night, pretending he wants to have a conversation but really just looking for distractions. Patrick calls him out on this, pointing out that SpongeBob is obviously just avoiding his essay. SpongeBob tries other diversions like making elaborate sandwiches and talking to the mailman about the philosophy of mail delivery until the guy walks away telling him to get back to his paper. The episode takes a surreal turn when SpongeBob's procrastination leads to a nightmare sequence. He imagines his furniture coming to life and taunting him about not finishing his work. His pants run away, his house catches fire, and starts talking to him, asking why he set it on fire and why he didn't just write his essay. The whole scene is genuinely unsettling as SpongeBob runs around in panic while everything burns. When SpongeBob wakes up from this nightmare, he realizes it's almost 9 a.m. and class starts in 5 minutes. He spent the entire night procrastinating and now has to write 800 words in just a few minutes. In his panic, he starts frantically writing about all the things he did instead of working, like feeding his snail, making sandwiches, lighting candles, and calling friends. He realizes these are all things you shouldn't do at a stoplight. The immediate aftermath shows SpongeBob rushing to school with his completed essay, proud that he managed to finish all 800 words. But when he gets there, the classroom is empty. Mrs. Puff shows up and explains that she had to cancel the assignment because she's going to a teacher's convention. Instead of writing essays, the class is just going to take a field trip to look at an actual stoplight. The episode ends with SpongeBob ripping his essay in half, then ripping himself in half in frustration. He spent all that time stressing about an assignment that ended up being canceled anyway. All his procrastination and last-minute panic was completely unnecessary since the work never needed to be done in the first place. What makes this episode relatable but also a bit uncomfortable is how accurately it captures the anxiety and stress that comes with procrastination. Most people have experienced that cycle of avoiding work, then panicking when deadlines approach, then feeling terrible about wasting so much time. SpongeBob's behavior is exaggerated but recognizable. The nightmare sequence is genuinely disturbing and shows how guilt and anxiety about unfinished work can affect someone's mental state. SpongeBob's subconscious is basically torturing him with images of his house burning down while asking why he didn't just do what he was supposed to do. The fact that even his pants abandon him suggests he feels like everything in his life is falling apart because of his procrastination. The episode also deals with the frustration of academic pressure and arbitrary assignments. SpongeBob is genuinely excited about learning and wants to do well, but he still struggles with actually completing the work. The fact that the assignment gets canceled after all his stress makes the whole experience feel pointless and adds to the absurdity of school bureaucracy. There's something sad about how SpongeBob's enthusiasm for the assignment quickly turns into avoidance and anxiety. He starts out thinking the essay will be easy and fun, but as soon as he sits down to actually write, he finds ways to avoid it. This pattern of initial excitement followed by avoidance is something many students experience. The ending where the assignment gets canceled could be seen as either relieving or frustrating depending on your perspective. On one hand, SpongeBob doesn't have to worry about being judged on work he rushed through at the last minute. On the other hand, all his stress and effort was completely wasted on something that didn't matter. It's a reminder that sometimes the things we worry about most end up being irrelevant. The episode manages to be both funny and stressful at the same time, which reflects how procrastination can feel in real life. While SpongeBob's distractions are silly, the underlying anxiety about unfinished work and approaching deadlines is very real and relatable to anyone who's ever put off doing something important. Now let's take a dive a bit deeper in the iceberg and explore the deep water. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. Let's get started with an episode that shows how paranoia and fear can completely destroy relationships and lead to actual torture. Crabborg takes SpongeBob's innocent movie night and turns it into a psychological horror story about false accusations and violent interrogation. SpongeBob settles in for a cozy night watching a scary robot movie called Night of the Robot while eating popcorn with Gary. The movie shows people being chased by giant robots, and SpongeBob gets completely absorbed in it despite Gary's warnings. What starts as harmless entertainment quickly messes with SpongeBob's head in dangerous ways. The psychological damage becomes clear when SpongeBob goes to bed after the movie. He starts questioning everyone around him, wondering if his mom might be a robot, if Uncle Sherm might be a robot, and even if Gary might be a robot. He pokes Gary's eye to test if he's real, showing how the movie has planted seeds of paranoia. SpongeBob can't sleep because he's having nightmares about being chased by the giant robot. The build-up to disaster starts the next day at the Krusty Krab when SpongeBob is still jumpy from the movie. He mistakes kitchen equipment for a robot and screams in terror. Meanwhile, Mr. Krabs is in his office, listening to techno music and counting money, completely unaware that his innocent behavior is about to be misinterpreted in the worst possible way. The situation gets worse when SpongeBob overhears Mr. Krabs talking to his radio and saying he feels recharged. To someone already primed to see robots everywhere, this sounds like exactly what a robot would say. When Mr. Krabs starts making beeping sounds while trying to get a song replayed and does a robotic dance to techno music, SpongeBob becomes convinced his boss has been replaced by a robot. SpongeBob tries to test whether Mr. Krabs is really a robot using methods from the film. He gets Mr. Krabs to listen to a joke to see if he can laugh, but Mr. Krabs doesn't find Squidward's terrible pirate pun funny. When SpongeBob tries to make Mr. Krabs cry with something sad, Mr. Krabs responds with practical workplace advice instead of emotion. When SpongeBob tests if Mr. Krabs can feel love, he just gives them a blank stare and tells Squidward to get back to work. The perfect storm happens when Mr. Krabs accidentally gets salt in his eyes while trying to eat a hard-boiled egg. His eyes turn bright red from irritation. He's holding metal tongs that look like robotic claws, and he has batteries in his pocket from his broken radio. To SpongeBob and Squidward, he now looks exactly like the robot from the movie. Red eyes, metal appendages, and running on batteries. They both scream in terror and become completely convinced their boss has been replaced. What follows is genuinely disturbing and crosses lines that children's television shouldn't cross. SpongeBob and Squidward decide they need to interrogate the robot to find out what happened to the real Mr. Krabs. They read a book called How to Torture, gather rope and weapons, then lock Mr. Krabs in his office and tie him to his chair. The fact that they have a torture manual in a kid's show is already concerning. The interrogation begins with them shining a bright light in Mr. Krabs' face while he's tied up and helpless. When Mr. Krabs asks what's happening, Squidward slaps him across the face and tells him to shut up. He calls Mr. Krabs a bucket of bolts, while Mr. Krabs desperately tries to explain that he's still himself. The power dynamic is completely reversed, with employees physically assaulting their restrained boss. The psychological torture escalates when they keep asking, "Where's Mr. Krabs?" while he insists, "I am Mr. Krabs." The repetition and refusal to accept his answers is a classic torture technique designed to break down someone's sense of reality. SpongeBob even slaps him and asks inappropriate questions, showing how the situation has devolved into complete chaos. When verbal abuse doesn't work, they escalate to destroying Mr. Krabs' personal property. Squidward smashes his blender, toaster, food processor, and coffee maker with a baseball bat, while Mr. Krabs screams about how much each item cost him. The systematic destruction of his belongings is meant to force him to talk by causing emotional distress. The torture reaches its most cruel point when they threaten his cash register. Mr. Krabs explains through tears that he raised it from when it was just a little calculator and loves it like his own child. When they prepare to smash it, he completely breaks down, crying and begging them to stop. This represents his life's work and dreams. The immediate aftermath reveals the horrible truth. SpongeBob suddenly remembers how the robot movie actually ended. There weren't any robots at all, it was just the character's imagination. He realizes they've just tortured an innocent person based on paranoid delusions inspired by a fictional movie. All the evidence they used to identify Mr. Krabs as a robot had innocent explanations they were too paranoid to consider. SpongeBob runs away in shame when he realizes what they've done, leaving Squidward alone with their victim. The episode ends with Mr. Krabs screaming Squidward's name in fury, suggesting their relationship has been permanently damaged by this incident. The long-term repercussions are deeply disturbing. 2 employees kidnapped their boss, tied him up, psychologically and physically abused him, destroyed his property, and made him beg for mercy while he was helpless. All based on paranoid assumptions triggered by a scary movie. Mr. Krabs will probably never trust his employees again. This episode shows how quickly fear and paranoia can turn normal people into torturers. The progression from Mr. Krabs is acting weird to let's tie him up and beat him happens remarkably fast. The fact that they had torture equipment readily available suggests this isn't their first time considering violence as a solution. The most disturbing aspect is how the episode treats actual torture techniques as comedy. Physical restraint, bright lights, repeated questioning, and property destruction are real methods used to break down prisoners. The show normalizes the idea that it's acceptable to hurt people when you're scared about their behavior. What makes this particularly unsettling is that Mr. Krabs never gets an apology. SpongeBob runs away when he realizes his mistake, and Squidward just tries to cover up the evidence. The episode suggests that torture is just a funny misunderstanding rather than a serious crime that leaves lasting psychological damage. It teaches kids that violence is an acceptable response to fear and confusion. Moving on to an episode that explores obsession, betrayal, and the lengths people will go to satisfy their curiosity. The secret box shows how Patrick manipulates SpongeBob's friendship and trust, while SpongeBob becomes so obsessed with secrets that he's willing to commit crimes to learn the truth. Patrick shows up with a mysterious box that he claims contains the most amazing secret in all of Bikini Bottom. He deliberately taunts SpongeBob with it, opening it just enough to laugh at what's inside but never letting SpongeBob see. Patrick describes it as something so secret and powerful that it would change SpongeBob's life if he saw it, building up the mystery to make SpongeBob more desperate to know. The psychological manipulation gets worse when Patrick makes SpongeBob share all of his own secrets first. SpongeBob reveals deeply personal things like sleeping with his shoes on, having overdue library books, and wearing 3 pairs of underwear thinking this will convince Patrick to reciprocate. But Patrick just takes this information and gives nothing back, showing how one-sided their friendship has become. The build-up to SpongeBob's breaking point comes when Patrick keeps showing off the box and describing how amazing the secret is. He says the inner workings of his mind are an enigma, while imagining a carton of milk spilling, suggesting he's not as deep as he pretends to be. When SpongeBob gets frustrated and shows off his own secret items, Patrick just laughs harder at his box, making SpongeBob feel inadequate and desperate. Patrick's manipulation becomes more cruel when he describes the box as containing the most secrety secret of all of Secret Dom and calls himself its sole witness. He acts like he's carrying some heavy burden that only he can handle, making SpongeBob feel excluded from something important. When SpongeBob tries to peek, Patrick slams the box shut and warns that nobody must know the mystery, treating SpongeBob like he's not trustworthy. The friendship starts to crack when they fight over the box and SpongeBob's arms literally pop off from the struggle. Patrick then threatens to end their friendship forever if SpongeBob ever comes near the box again, showing how he's willing to use their relationship as a weapon. The flashback to their friendship from babies to old age to their graves shows how much this relationship means to SpongeBob, making Patrick's threat particularly cruel. SpongeBob's obsession drives him to break into Patrick's house in the middle of the night. He puts on gloves and a ski mask like a real burglar and tries to steal the box while Patrick sleeps. The sequence is genuinely tense, as SpongeBob creeps around making noise that should wake Patrick, but somehow doesn't. Every step he takes makes loud sounds like broken glass, car crashes, and machine guns, but Patrick continues sleeping through it all. The breaking and entering gets more dangerous when SpongeBob trips and bounces around Patrick's house, making enough noise to wake the entire neighborhood. But Patrick remains unconscious, suggesting either that he's an unnaturally heavy sleeper or that something else is going on. When Patrick finally wakes up, he doesn't recognize SpongeBob even when he's standing right in front of him. The betrayal gets worse when Patrick realizes it's SpongeBob and says that his best friend would never steal from him. This makes SpongeBob feel even more guilty about his actions. But Patrick is the one who drove him to this point through psychological manipulation. Patrick acts like the victim even though he's been emotionally torturing SpongeBob for hours with his secret box. The immediate aftermath shows SpongeBob having a complete emotional breakdown. He cries about soiling their friendship garden and begs Patrick for forgiveness. The guilt and shame he feels are genuine, but they're the result of Patrick's manipulation rather than SpongeBob actually doing something wrong. Patrick eventually forgives him, but continues to taunt him with descriptions of how great the secret is. The final reveal shows that the box just contains a piece of string. After all the build-up, manipulation, and near destruction of their friendship, the greatest secret ever is completely ordinary. SpongeBob feels foolish for getting so worked up over nothing, and Patrick seems to enjoy watching him feel stupid about his obsession. But then comes the real twist that makes everything much worse. After SpongeBob leaves, Patrick reveals that there's actually a hidden compartment in the box activated by pulling the string. Inside is an embarrassing photo of SpongeBob from a Christmas party. This means Patrick was lying the entire time and actually did have something he didn't want SpongeBob to see, something that was specifically about SpongeBob himself. The long-term repercussions are deeply disturbing because Patrick gets away with manipulating his best friend for his own amusement. He deliberately made SpongeBob feel left out, drove him to commit a crime, nearly ended their friendship, and then revealed he was hiding something embarrassing about SpongeBob all along. SpongeBob was right to be suspicious, but Patrick made him feel crazy and guilty for having those instincts. This episode shows how toxic friendships can involve one person having power over another through secrets and manipulation. Patrick enjoys watching SpongeBob suffer and uses their friendship as leverage to control him. He gets entertainment from SpongeBob's desperation and pain, which is genuinely sadistic behavior disguised as playful teasing. The fact that Patrick was hiding an embarrassing photo of SpongeBob makes his behavior even more twisted. He could have just shown SpongeBob the picture or explained that he had something personal he wanted to keep private. Instead, he chose to torture his friend psychologically and drive him to criminal behavior, all while hiding something that violated SpongeBob's privacy and dignity. The episode normalizes the idea that friends can manipulate and emotionally abuse each other as long as it's done with a smile. Patrick's behavior is presented as harmless fun rather than the psychological manipulation it actually is. SpongeBob ends up apologizing for trying to learn a secret that was actually about him, which sends a terrible message about who deserves apologies in manipulative relationships. What makes this particularly disturbing is that children watching might learn that this kind of behavior is acceptable between friends. The episode suggests that it's funny to make people desperate for information, drive them to extreme actions, and then reveal that you were hiding something about them all along. It teaches kids that psychological manipulation is just part of friendship rather than a form of emotional abuse. Now let's talk about an episode that turns pet care into a war zone and shows how stubbornness can lead to genuinely dangerous situations. Gary Takes a Bath starts with a simple request but escalates into SpongeBob using increasingly extreme and harmful methods to force his pet to comply. SpongeBob announces it's bath time for Gary, but Gary clearly doesn't want to get in the tub. His pupils dilate in fear when he hears the word bath, showing that this is genuinely traumatic for him. Instead of respecting his pet's boundaries or finding gentler ways to encourage bathing, SpongeBob decides that Gary must be forced to comply no matter what it takes. The manipulation starts with SpongeBob trying to trick Gary with a boomerang toy that doesn't work properly and ends up hitting SpongeBob in the head. This sets the tone for how the entire episode will go, with SpongeBob's increasingly desperate attempts backfiring and causing harm. When simple tricks don't work, SpongeBob decides to escalate to more extreme measures. The psychological warfare begins when SpongeBob straps a bomb to his own chest and tells Gary it will explode in 3 seconds unless he takes a bath. The bomb actually goes off, showing that SpongeBob was willing to harm himself to manipulate his pet into compliance. This is showing a pet owner using self-harm as emotional blackmail against an animal who can't understand the situation. The mental manipulation escalates when SpongeBob tries subliminal messages with disturbing images, including what he describes as a disturbing picture of a giggling girl. He's literally trying to brainwash Gary into compliance using methods that could traumatize him. The fact that SpongeBob acknowledges the image is disturbing but uses it anyway shows how far he's willing to go to get his way. When psychological manipulation fails, SpongeBob turns to physical violence. He tricks Gary into playing leapfrog and throws him into the wall so hard that Gary's shell breaks and needs bandages. This is straight up animal abuse, disguised as play, and Gary is clearly hurt by the experience. But instead of feeling guilty or changing his approach, SpongeBob just keeps trying more dangerous methods. The build-up to the main disaster comes when SpongeBob decides to use water as a weapon. He absorbs all the bath water into his body and starts spraying it at Gary like he's using a high-pressure hose. Gary has to run and hide to avoid getting hit by these water blasts, climbing up into a tree to escape. SpongeBob follows him and continues the assault from above, showing no concern for Gary's obvious fear and distress. The chase sequence becomes genuinely disturbing as Gary desperately tries to escape from his own owner. He's using his natural abilities to float and climb just to avoid being hurt, while SpongeBob pursues him relentlessly with water attacks. The power dynamic is completely wrong, with the caregiver becoming the threat that the pet needs to escape from. The situation reaches its peak when SpongeBob falls out of the tree and lands in mud, getting himself dirty in the process. This is where Gary reveals he was manipulating the situation all along, deliberately leading SpongeBob to get muddy so that SpongeBob would have to take a bath himself. The tables have turned, but only because Gary was forced to outsmart his abusive owner to survive. The immediate aftermath shows Gary smugly watching SpongeBob clean himself in the bathtub, while SpongeBob complains about having to wash behind his ears. Gary's satisfied expression suggests he feels like he's gotten revenge for all the abuse he suffered. The power dynamic has shifted, but the underlying problem hasn't been solved because SpongeBob still doesn't understand that he was wrong. SpongeBob never acknowledges that his behavior was abusive or apologizes to Gary for the harm he caused. Instead, he acts like Gary was just being difficult and that the whole situation was Gary's fault for not wanting to take a bath in the first place. This lack of awareness means the cycle is likely to continue, with SpongeBob using force and manipulation whenever Gary doesn't want to do something. The long-term repercussions are troubling because the episode treats animal abuse as comedy and suggests that pets who don't want to be bathed are being unreasonable. SpongeBob used bombs, physical violence, psychological manipulation, and water torture against a pet who was just expressing a preference. Gary was forced to use his intelligence to escape harm rather than being treated with respect and care. This episode normalizes the idea that pet owners have the right to force their animals to comply through any means necessary, no matter how harmful or traumatic. It suggests that animals don't have the right to refuse things they don't like, and that their fear and distress should be ignored in favor of what the owner wants. The fact that Gary ultimately outsmarts SpongeBob doesn't change the abuse he endured. What makes this particularly disturbing is how it could influence children's treatment of real animals. Kids watching might learn that it's acceptable to use force, fear, and pain to make pets do what they want. They might think that animal resistance is just stubbornness that needs to be overcome rather than communication that should be respected. The episode also shows how quickly caregivers can become abusers when their authority is challenged. SpongeBob goes from loving pet owner to violent manipulator in a matter of minutes, all because Gary won't do what he wants. This pattern of escalating control and abuse is common in toxic relationships, and seeing it presented as comedy in a children's show is deeply concerning. The fact that Gary has to trick SpongeBob into learning his lesson rather than SpongeBob recognizing his mistakes shows how little character growth actually happens. SpongeBob doesn't develop empathy or learn to respect Gary's autonomy, he just gets outsmarted by his victim. This suggests that the abuse will continue whenever Gary can't find clever ways to avoid it. Let's examine an episode that shows how desperation for social status can lead to destruction, manipulation, and toxic relationships. House Fancy takes Squidward's rivalry with Squilliam and turns it into a story about how people will hurt those closest to them when their ego is threatened. Squidward is enjoying his favorite TV show, House Fancy, when he gets a devastating phone call from Squilliam Fancyson, his lifelong rival. Squilliam reveals that he's actually on the show right now, being featured for his amazing house. The psychological torture begins immediately as Squilliam gets to show off his wealth and sophistication on television while Squidward watches helplessly from his couch, feeling inadequate and poor. The build-up to Squidward's breakdown comes as he's forced to watch Squilliam's house tour on live TV. Squilliam has a massive mansion with gilded doorknobs, a jewel-encrusted toilet paper holder, a whirlpool bath elevator, and a 130-foot sculpture of his unibrow made entirely of doorknobs. Every detail is designed to make Squidward feel like a failure, and the TV host keeps gushing about how fancy everything is. The manipulation reaches its peak when the show's host calls Squidward personally after he desperately claims his house is fancier than Squilliam's. Squidward is given just 2 hours to get his house ready for television, setting up an impossible deadline that guarantees failure. He immediately starts panicking about stains, holes in the wall, and faded spots that need to be fixed, knowing he can't possibly make his modest house look impressive. The main event begins when SpongeBob volunteers to help, but Squidward is so desperate and stressed that he becomes abusive toward his friend. He gives SpongeBob the supposedly simple task of painting one faded spot on the wall. But his instructions are unclear and contradictory. When SpongeBob misunderstands and paints the entire living room in chaotic splatters, Squidward screams at him and calls him names instead of taking responsibility for his poor communication. The situation escalates when they try to move a sofa together. Squidward is so frantic and impatient that he keeps moving before SpongeBob is ready, causing the sofa to repeatedly crush his own foot. Each time this happens, he screams in pain, but then immediately blames SpongeBob for following his contradictory instructions. When the sofa finally rips off his toenail, Squidward becomes even more angry and irrational. Squidward's treatment of SpongeBob becomes genuinely cruel as his desperation increases. He yells, "I don't need you," and tries to move the sofa himself, but slips on his own toenail and crashes. When SpongeBob offers encouragement by saying the broken sofa will be easier to move, Squidward just gets more frustrated. He then abandons SpongeBob to deal with cleaning up while he goes upstairs to tend to his injury. The destruction reaches its climax when SpongeBob tries to help by vacuuming while Squidward is gone. The vacuum switch breaks when SpongeBob tries to turn up the power, causing the machine to go haywire and suck up everything in Squidward's house. The vacuum bag grows larger and larger as it consumes furniture, decorations, and eventually SpongeBob himself. When Squidward returns, his entire house is about to explode from the overstuffed vacuum. The situation gets even worse when Patrick barges in to use Squidward's toilet, apparently producing something so toxic that the toilet itself comes out begging to be put out of its misery before dying. This adds biological horror to the already devastating situation as Squidward watches his home being destroyed from multiple directions. The vacuum finally explodes and completely destroys Squidward's house, leaving nothing but rubble where his home used to be. All of his possessions are gone, his furniture is destroyed, and his desperate attempt to impress his rival has resulted in losing everything he owns. SpongeBob emerges from the wreckage relatively unharmed, but Squidward's entire life has been ruined. The immediate aftermath shows the TV crew arriving to find Squidward's house completely destroyed. Instead of being sympathetic to what's obviously a disaster, the host declares that Squidward has created a revolutionary new style of post-primitive design inspired by famous designer Saul Limkins. Squidward plays along with this misunderstanding, claiming he studied this designer for years. The cruel irony comes when Squidward gets featured on the show and wins the House Fancy Prince of the Year award that was supposed to go to Squilliam. His complete failure and destruction gets reinterpreted as artistic genius, while Squilliam is left crying and defeated. SpongeBob innocently tells the sobbing Squilliam that success hasn't changed Squidward and he's still the same great guy. The long-term repercussions reveal how toxic the rivalry between Squidward and Squilliam really is, and how it affects innocent people caught in the middle. Squidward was willing to risk everything and abuse his friend just for a chance to one-up his rival. SpongeBob suffered verbal abuse, physical danger, and emotional manipulation while trying to help someone who treated him terribly. What makes this episode particularly disturbing is how Squidward's desperation transforms him into an abuser. He goes from being SpongeBob's friend to screaming at him, blaming him for everything that goes wrong, and treating him like an incompetent servant. The stress of trying to impress Squilliam brings out the worst in Squidward's character and shows how social pressure can turn people into monsters. The episode also shows how people will sacrifice their relationships and values for social status. Squidward destroys his friendship with SpongeBob, ruins his own home, and puts himself through extreme stress just to avoid being embarrassed on television. His ego is more important to him than the well-being of people who care about him. The fact that Squidward gets rewarded for this behavior sends a terrible message about how society values appearances over character. He wins an award and gets recognition because his disaster gets misinterpreted as artistic vision. Meanwhile, SpongeBob gets no credit for trying to help, and Squilliam's suffering is treated as entertainment. This episode normalizes the idea that it's acceptable to abuse people when you're under pressure, and that personal rivalries justify hurting innocent bystanders. It suggests that being fake and manipulative can lead to success, while being genuine and helpful gets you ignored or mistreated. The toxic dynamic between Squidward and Squilliam ends up destroying everything around them. Next up is an episode that shows what happens when someone completely unfit to care for others is given responsibility for a helpless creature, Pet Sitter. Pat turns Patrick's stupidity from harmless comedy into genuine neglect that could have killed Gary. SpongeBob needs to visit his grandmother for her birthday, but doesn't want to leave Gary alone. When he asks Squidward to pet sit, Squidward refuses because Gary destroyed his garden by eating it. So SpongeBob turns to Patrick, who immediately drops Gary on the ground when handed to him, showing that he's not capable of basic care. But SpongeBob is so desperate that he ignores this obvious red flag and leaves detailed instructions for Gary's care. The build-up to disaster starts immediately when Patrick throws away SpongeBob's carefully written list without reading it. He claims he doesn't need instructions and knows what to do, but then his stomach starts hurting from eating too many coral balls, and he runs to the bathroom. Gary is left alone while Patrick disappears for what appears to be hours, already starting to dehydrate and weaken. The neglect becomes dangerous when Patrick finally comes back and doesn't realize Gary is suffering. Gary is making weak meowing sounds and clearly showing signs of distress, but Patrick either doesn't notice or doesn't understand what these signals mean. When Gary tries to get to his food bag to eat, Patrick calls him by wrong names like Fred and Barry, showing he doesn't even recognize Gary as an individual. The situation gets worse when Patrick decides to help Gary eat, but completely misunderstands how pet care works. He tears open Gary's food bag and eats most of it himself, leaving only crumbs that fall on Gary. Patrick seems to think this counts as feeding Gary, but Gary is still starving and getting weaker. When SpongeBob calls to check on things, Patrick lies and says everything is fine while Gary is clearly suffering in the background. The main event shows Patrick's complete failure to understand basic animal needs. When SpongeBob mentions giving Gary a bath, Patrick takes this instruction and turns it into something dangerous and traumatic. He fills the kitchen sink with water and dumps Gary's food into it, creating a disgusting soup instead of a proper bath. When Gary tries to eat the floating food because he's starving, Patrick stops him and tries to force him into the contaminated water. Gary becomes increasingly desperate as his basic needs continue to be ignored. He starts eating everything in the house out of starvation, including SpongeBob's hat, spatula, all the Krabby Patties, the stove, and somehow even Old Man Jenkins, who ends up talking from inside Gary's stomach saying he doesn't want to be a burden. This is clearly a sign that Gary is in serious distress, but Patrick's response is to give him medicine for overeating rather than recognizing that Gary was starving. The abuse reaches its peak when Patrick decides Gary needs to be tricked into taking a bath. He uses a flamethrower to burn SpongeBob's bed, terrifying Gary and destroying property in the process. The flames and smoke create a genuinely dangerous situation, but Patrick thinks this will somehow convince Gary that water is better than fire. When that doesn't work, Patrick uses a garden hose to spray Gary while pouring soap flakes on him, then uses a hairdryer to over-dry him until he looks completely mummified. The neglect continues as Patrick leaves multiple water sources running throughout the house. The broken shower upstairs keeps flowing, the kitchen sink is still on, and the hose is still spraying water everywhere. Patrick falls asleep on the couch while the entire house floods around them, showing complete disregard for both Gary's safety and SpongeBob's property. The immediate aftermath shows SpongeBob's house completely flooded and destroyed when he returns from his grandmother's birthday party. Gary and Patrick are floating around on furniture while SpongeBob's belongings are ruined. The house is uninhabitable, Gary has been traumatized, and Patrick acts like everything went fine. When SpongeBob asks what happened, Patrick just makes jokes about Gary wanting another bath. SpongeBob finds Gary trying to read him a bedtime story from a book called Snail Tales, but Patrick reveals he thought the book was called Meow, 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 because that's all he heard when Gary was trying to communicate. This shows that Patrick never understood Gary was trying to talk to him throughout the entire ordeal, treating Gary's distress calls as meaningless noise. The long-term repercussions are disturbing because Patrick faces no consequences for his neglect and abuse. Gary could have died from dehydration, starvation, or the various dangerous situations Patrick put him in. SpongeBob's house is destroyed, his belongings are ruined, and his pet is traumatized, but Patrick just walks away without learning anything or taking responsibility. This episode is particularly troubling because it shows how people who are mentally incapable of providing care are often still expected to do so. Patrick's cognitive limitations make him genuinely dangerous to have around vulnerable creatures, but no one recognizes this or takes steps to protect Gary. The episode treats life-threatening animal neglect as comedy rather than the serious issue it actually is. What makes this even more disturbing is how Patrick's incompetence is presented as innocent rather than harmful. His inability to understand basic needs or follow simple instructions puts Gary's life at risk. The episode suggests that good intentions excuse the harm caused by negligence, which is a dangerous message about caregiving responsibilities. The fact that SpongeBob doesn't seem angry about the destruction or concerned about Gary's suffering shows how normalized this kind of treatment has become. Patrick has probably caused similar disasters before, and everyone just accepts it as part of his personality rather than recognizing it as a serious problem that needs to be addressed. This episode could teach children that it's acceptable to ignore the needs of pets and other vulnerable creatures as long as you don't mean any harm. It normalizes neglect and suggests that incompetence is an excuse for causing suffering, which could lead to real animals being harmed by people who think Patrick's behavior is funny rather than abusive. Finally, let's examine an episode that shows how good intentions can become toxic enabling and how society treats people with disabilities. Stuck in the Ringer starts with a simple accident but becomes a story about blame, shame, and the cruelty of people who claim to care. SpongeBob gets stuck in his clothes wringer after slipping on soap in his bathroom. When Patrick arrives looking for his rubber duck, SpongeBob asks for help getting unstuck. But Patrick completely misunderstands the situation and makes it worse by applying forever glue to the wringer, permanently trapping SpongeBob inside it. What should have been a simple rescue becomes a life-changing disability. The build-up to SpongeBob's suffering begins when he realizes he's now stuck forever and starts panicking about how he'll get to work. Instead of taking responsibility for his mistake or helping find a solution, Patrick gives SpongeBob a manipulative, motivational speech about not being a quitter. He tells SpongeBob not to let the wringer get between him and his passion, making it sound like this is a challenge to overcome rather than a serious problem that needs fixing. Patrick's toxic positivity gets worse when he describes all the wonderful things about Krabby Patties while a patriotic flag appears behind them. He's essentially gaslighting SpongeBob into thinking this disability is actually an opportunity, making SpongeBob feel like he'd be a failure if he can't adapt to being permanently trapped. This kind of forced optimism puts all the responsibility on the disabled person to adjust, rather than on society to provide help. The first signs of how cruel this situation will become appear at the Krusty Krab, where SpongeBob tries to work while trapped in the wringer. He struggles to cook and serve food, rigging up elaborate systems with spatulas and kicking ingredients to try to do his job. When Squidward sees him, instead of showing compassion or offering help, he immediately mocks SpongeBob's appearance and calls him an imbecile. Squidward's cruelty escalates when he asks where SpongeBob got his outfit and suggests he bought it at a hardware store. He tells SpongeBob that the wringer really completes your imbecile look and gives himself a thumbs up for the insult. This shows how people with visible disabilities are often treated as objects of ridicule rather than human beings deserving respect. The situation gets worse when SpongeBob's disability makes him unable to perform basic tasks safely. He accidentally squirts mustard in Squidward's eyes, hits the cash register causing it to fall on a customer, and spills money everywhere. Instead of recognizing that SpongeBob needs accommodations to do his job safely, Mr. Krabs treats these accidents as intentional destruction and throws him out of the restaurant. Mr. Krabs shows no empathy for SpongeBob's situation, screaming that he's helped quite enough and banning him from returning until the destructive device is gone. He's essentially firing SpongeBob for being disabled, treating the ringer as something SpongeBob chose rather than a permanent condition he's stuck with. This kind of workplace discrimination against disabled people is presented as reasonable rather than illegal and cruel. The social isolation begins when SpongeBob tries to do normal activities but finds that his disability makes everything impossible. At the ice cream parlor, he can't eat because his hands are trapped. At the carnival, he gets a black eye from trying to play ball toss and gets flung out of rides because he can't hold on. Patrick continues to act like everything is fine and keeps suggesting activities that SpongeBob obviously can't do. The breaking point comes when SpongeBob finally snaps and tells Patrick that he ruined his life by using the forever glue. Patrick acts hurt and claims he was only trying to help, but this is manipulation because he never listened to what SpongeBob actually needed. When SpongeBob rightfully calls him out for making things worse, Patrick storms off crying and playing the victim. The most disturbing part happens when a crowd forms around them during their argument. A character named Sandals tells SpongeBob that his body isn't the problem, it's his heart, and that he deserves what happened to him. The entire crowd turns against SpongeBob, calling him born mean, and walking away in disgust. They're literally blaming a disabled person for being upset about his situation. This public shaming scene shows how society often expects disabled people to be grateful and positive at all times. When SpongeBob expresses frustration about his limitations, he's treated as ungrateful and mean, rather than someone dealing with a legitimate disability. The crowd's reaction suggests that disabled people aren't allowed to have negative emotions about their conditions. SpongeBob becomes completely isolated and depressed, sitting in his dark house watching static on TV while developing stubble and talking about being not fit to live in society. Patrick finds him in this catatonic state, talking about lonely voices in his head, showing how the social rejection has driven him to a mental breakdown. This is what happens when disabled people are abandoned by their community. The immediate aftermath shows Patrick finally realizing the harm he's caused when he sees SpongeBob's complete psychological collapse. His tears accidentally dissolve the forever glue, freeing SpongeBob from the ringer. But this resolution suggests that disabled people just need to wait for others to feel sorry enough for them rather than deserving help and accommodation as a basic right. The long-term repercussions are disturbing because the episode treats disability as something that happens because of personal failings rather than accidents or circumstances beyond people's control. It suggests that disabled people should be grateful for their conditions and that expressing frustration makes them bad people. The fact that SpongeBob gets cured at the end, rather than learning to live with his disability, sends the message that being disabled is inherently wrong. This episode is particularly harmful because it reinforces negative stereotypes about disabled people while disguising them as moral lessons. It teaches viewers that disabled people who complain are ungrateful, that society doesn't need to provide accommodations, and that disability is essentially a character flaw. The toxic positivity and victim blaming throughout the episode normalize discrimination against people with disabilities. The ending where SpongeBob tells viewers that crying does solve your problems after all undermines everything the episode supposedly taught about perseverance and adaptation. It suggests that the real solution to disability is magical thinking rather than practical support, accessibility, or social change. This kind of messaging can be genuinely harmful to disabled viewers who don't have cartoon solutions available to them. Moving deeper into the iceberg, let's talk about the abyss. But before we talk about that, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Next up is an episode where Mr. Krabs literally drives someone to try killing themselves. One course meal is basically psychological torture disguised as a kid's cartoon, and somehow Nickelodeon thought this was okay to air. The whole thing starts with Plankton doing his usual villain routine. He's got explosives, robot arms, the works. He's actually winning for once and has Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob trapped. Then Pearl walks in asking for her dad, and Plankton completely freaks out. He starts screaming and runs away like he's seen a monster. Turns out whales ate his entire family, so he's genuinely terrified of them. Now here's where things get messed up. Instead of feeling bad for Plankton or just being glad the threat is over, Mr. Krabs sees this fear and thinks, perfect, I can use this. He literally decides to torture someone using their worst trauma. That's not cartoon villain behavior, that's serial killer stuff. Mr. Krabs borrows Pearl's dress and starts stalking Plankton around town. He jumps out of dumpsters, sneaks into the chum bucket, and appears whenever Plankton feels safe. He's deliberately trying to make Plankton think he's being hunted by a whale. When Plankton tries to tell his wife what's happening, she doesn't believe him, so he's completely alone with this terror. The really disturbing part is what this does to Plankton over time. The show jumps forward 16 days and Plankton has completely lost it. He's got a long beard, overgrown nails, and he's wearing tissue boxes as shoes. He can't leave his chair because he thinks the whale will see him. He's crying constantly and having nightmares about being eaten alive by whales. Then Plankton does something that should never happen in a kid's show. He walks into the middle of the road and lies down, waiting for a bus to kill him. He literally tells SpongeBob he's trying to die and asks him to step on him. When SpongeBob won't do it, Plankton says he'll wait for the next bus. This is a suicide attempt, plain and simple. Think about what we just watched. A business owner used someone's family trauma to psychologically torture them for over 2 weeks until they wanted to die. And the show treats this like it's funny. There's circus music playing while we watch someone have a mental breakdown. The episode tries to fix things at the end when SpongeBob tells Plankton the truth. Plankton gets revenge by scaring Mr. Krabs with a mime, but that's not even close to being equal. Mr. Krabs got scared for a few minutes while Plankton was tortured for weeks and tried to kill himself. What makes this really bad is that Mr. Krabs doesn't get in trouble for any of this. Nobody calls the police, nobody fires him, nobody even tells him what he did was wrong. The show acts like driving someone to suicide is just business as usual because Plankton is supposed to be the bad guy. This episode aired during kids' TV time slots. Parents thought they were putting on SpongeBob for their children and instead got an episode about trauma, psychological abuse, and suicide. Kids watched this thinking it was normal cartoon behavior, which is honestly terrifying. The worst part is how the show presents everything. Mr. Krabs isn't treated like a monster for what he did. Plankton's suffering is played for laughs. The suicide attempt has funny music over it. The episode takes serious mental health issues and treats them like comedy material. One-course meal shows how far SpongeBob had fallen by this point. The early episodes were about friendship and fun, but this is just cruelty dressed up as entertainment. It's not funny, it's not clever, it's just disturbing. No kid show should ever include psychological torture and suicide attempts, but here we are. This episode crossed every line possible and showed that SpongeBob was willing to go anywhere for shock value, even if it meant traumatizing viewers in the process. Moving on to an episode that shows what happens when someone refuses to believe their pet is in danger and blames them for being the victim. A pal for Gary takes SpongeBob's love for Gary and turns it into willful ignorance that nearly gets his pet killed. SpongeBob feels guilty about leaving Gary alone all day while he works, so he decides to get Gary a companion. He goes to a pet store where a creepy old lady tries to warn him about the creatures she's selling. She keeps saying they're rare and extremely dangerous, and shows him a picture of one attacking a cat. But SpongeBob isn't listening because he's too excited about his idea. SpongeBob picks out a green nudibranch that he names Puffy Fluffy and brings it home to Gary. The thing immediately shows its true nature by snarling at Gary when SpongeBob isn't looking, but acts cute and innocent whenever SpongeBob turns around. Gary tries to warn SpongeBob by meowing frantically, but SpongeBob just thinks Gary is being rude to their new friend. The manipulation gets worse when SpongeBob sets up a shared food bowl for both pets. Gary tries to eat his own food, but Puffy Fluffy scares him away and devours everything. When SpongeBob comes back and sees Gary hiding behind the TV, he scolds Gary for not sharing and not being nice to Puffy Fluffy. Gary is literally being starved and terrorized, but SpongeBob thinks Gary is the problem. Things escalate when SpongeBob forces them to play together. Puffy Fluffy starts attacking Gary with toys, ripping apart a squeaky carrot with razor-sharp teeth. Gary runs away and jumps on SpongeBob's head for protection, but SpongeBob gets angry and puts Gary in timeout for ruining dinner and refusing to show respect. Gary is being punished for trying to survive. The real horror begins at bedtime when SpongeBob puts both pets on the same small bed and covers them with a blanket. As soon as SpongeBob leaves, Puffy Fluffy sheds its skin like a snake, revealing it was just a disguise. The real creature underneath is a massive monster with multiple tongues and rows of sharp teeth. Gary realizes he's trapped in bed with something that wants to eat him. Gary tries to run to SpongeBob for help, but SpongeBob just carries him back to bed and tells him to be good. Gary is literally trying to escape a predator, but SpongeBob thinks he's just being difficult. Throughout the night, Gary fights for his life while SpongeBob sleeps peacefully upstairs, completely unaware that his pet is being hunted by a monster. The house gets destroyed as Gary runs from the creature, trying to use kitchen tools to defend himself. He starts fires, breaks furniture, and makes noise trying to survive, but SpongeBob just keeps sleeping. When SpongeBob finally wakes up, he finds his house wrecked and immediately blames Gary for everything. He doesn't even consider that something else might have caused the damage. The most disturbing part comes when SpongeBob finds Gary in the exercise room, about to be eaten by the fully grown monster. Puffy Fluffy has Gary wrapped in its tongues and is about to swallow him alive. But instead of saving Gary, SpongeBob yells at Gary to put Puffy Fluffy down and calls him a bad pet. Gary is literally being murdered, and SpongeBob thinks Gary is the aggressor. SpongeBob keeps scolding Gary even as the monster is clearly trying to eat him. He tells Gary he's disappointed in him and that this is exactly what he was talking about. Only when the monster turns its attention to SpongeBob and starts eating him does he finally realize something is wrong. Gary has to save SpongeBob from the creature he brought home. Gary puts on his cowboy gear and uses his leash like a lasso to fight off the monster and save SpongeBob's life. He manages to get the creature outside and chase it away, proving he was trying to protect them both all along. But SpongeBob's reaction is to ask Gary what he has to say for himself, still acting like Gary was the problem. The episode ends with SpongeBob taking Gary to work with him so Gary won't be lonely anymore. But this completely misses the point because Gary was never lonely. He was trying to warn SpongeBob about danger and got blamed for being the victim. SpongeBob never acknowledges that he was wrong or apologizes for not believing Gary. This episode is particularly disturbing because it shows how people can be willfully blind to abuse happening right in front of them. SpongeBob sees Gary being terrorized and starved, but chooses to believe Gary is just being difficult. He punishes the victim and protects the abuser because it's easier than admitting he made a mistake. The fact that Gary almost dies because SpongeBob won't listen to him is genuinely upsetting. Gary tries every way he can to communicate that he's in danger, but SpongeBob interprets all of his distress signals as bad behavior. Even when Gary saves both their lives, SpongeBob acts like Gary owes him an explanation. A pal for Gary teaches kids that adults won't believe them when they're in danger and that they'll be blamed for being victims. It normalizes the idea that people in authority will side with abusers and punish those who try to speak up. That's a genuinely harmful message disguised as a cartoon about pets. The episode also shows how dangerous it can be when people ignore warning signs and expert advice. The pet store owner explicitly told SpongeBob these creatures were dangerous, but he dismissed her concerns. Gary showed clear signs of distress from the beginning, but SpongeBob ignored them. Multiple red flags were ignored because SpongeBob preferred his fantasy about getting Gary a friend. What makes this even more disturbing is how SpongeBob's good intentions make everything worse. He genuinely wants to help Gary, but his refusal to listen or admit mistakes nearly gets Gary killed. The episode suggests that meaning well is enough to excuse harmful behavior, even when someone almost dies as a result. The power dynamic between SpongeBob and Gary makes this particularly unsettling. Gary can't speak human language, so he has to rely on SpongeBob to understand his needs and protect him. When SpongeBob fails to do this and actively works against Gary's safety, it shows how vulnerable pets and children are to the adults who control their lives. This episode crossed major lines by showing an innocent creature being terrorized while the person responsible for protecting him actively enables the abuse. It's not just dark humor anymore, it's a genuinely disturbing story about willful ignorance, victim blaming, and the failure of those in power to protect the vulnerable. Next up is an episode that deals with clinical depression and shows how toxic positivity can make mental health issues worse. Are You Happy Now? Takes Squidward's usual grumpiness and turns it into a genuine psychological breakdown that's genuinely hard to watch. The whole thing starts when SpongeBob is looking through his happy memory book at work, laughing and gasping at pictures of himself at the Krusty Krab. When Squidward asks what's so great about a work schedule, SpongeBob explains that the Krusty Krab is where all his happiest memories happened. He even has a whole cabinet full of backup copies of these memories. When SpongeBob asks about Squidward's happiest memory, something disturbing happens. Squidward tries to think of one and we see his thought bubble, but there's nothing there except TV static and color bars. He realizes he doesn't have a single happy memory and just says, "Oh well, like it doesn't matter," but then he starts crying uncontrollably at his register, showing this revelation has really messed him up. SpongeBob tries to help by creating artificial happy memories for Squidward, but every attempt goes horribly wrong. At a concert, a violin bow flies off and stabs Squidward in the eye. At an art museum, Squidward gets excited when he sees his own sculpture displayed, but then a performance artist named Fiasco melts it with a flamethrower while everyone applauds. In a hot air balloon, Squidward reveals he's afraid of heights right before SpongeBob pops the balloon with a needle. Each failed attempt makes Squidward more depressed and hopeless. After the mountain climbing disaster where they cause an avalanche, Squidward finally gives up completely. He tells SpongeBob he'll never have a happiest memory, and that if he does, it definitely won't involve him. This is when things get really dark. Squidward goes home and tells his house, "Hello, misery, I'm home," before going upstairs to bed. He says he might as well sleep for 100 years and tell someone to wake him when he's dead. He literally rolls under his bed to hide from the world, showing classic signs of severe depression. The really disturbing part comes when the show jumps forward 2 weeks and SpongeBob realizes Squidward hasn't come out of his house at all. When SpongeBob tries to check on him, Squidward won't answer the door and pulls his blind shut when he sees SpongeBob at the window. He's completely isolated himself from everyone and everything. SpongeBob's attempts to contact Squidward get increasingly desperate. He calls him on the phone, but Squidward throws it out the window. SpongeBob tries to fax himself to Squidward's house, but Squidward puts him through a paper shredder and dumps the pieces out the window. Every attempt at connection is rejected because Squidward has given up on life entirely. The episode shows Squidward's mental state getting worse and worse. He tries to cheer himself up by baking brownies, but they come out burned and make him feel even more hopeless. He's lost the ability to do basic tasks or take care of himself. When SpongeBob sneaks into his house, we see Squidward has been living in complete darkness and despair. SpongeBob's solution is to throw Squidward a surprise party with paper cutouts of himself, but this makes everything worse. The party is just SpongeBob talking to fake versions of himself while Squidward sits there, feeling more alone than ever. When SpongeBob asks if this is his happiest memory, Squidward completely snaps. The breakdown that follows is genuinely disturbing. Squidward screams that he doesn't want a happiest memory and starts violently destroying all the paper SpongeBobs. His eyes turn into angry skulls and he goes completely feral, ripping apart decorations and laughing maniacally. He says destroying everything makes him feel wonderful, and that this is his happiest memory. What makes this really dark is that Squidward's happy moment comes from violence and destruction. After weeks of depression and failed attempts at normal happiness, the only thing that makes him feel good is tearing things apart. This suggests his mental state has deteriorated to the point where only extreme actions can penetrate his numbness. The episode ends with SpongeBob watching Squidward destroy everything and saying, "He's so handsome, like this violent breakdown is somehow romantic or appealing." This completely misses the point that what they're watching is a mental health crisis, not something to admire or find attractive. The most disturbing aspect is how the episode treats depression as something that can be fixed with the right activities rather than a serious medical condition. SpongeBob keeps trying to manufacture happiness for Squidward instead of recognizing that he needs professional help. The toxic positivity throughout the episode suggests that people who can't be cheered up are just not trying hard enough. The fact that Squidward's only moment of joy comes from destroying things is really concerning. It shows how depression can warp someone's relationship with pleasure and satisfaction. When normal activities stop providing any positive feelings, when key structuring, some people turn to destructive behaviors just to feel something. Are You Happy Now? Accidentally creates a realistic portrayal of severe depression, including the isolation, inability to function, and loss of interest in everything. But then it treats this serious condition as comedy material and suggests that violent outbursts are a valid form of happiness. That's genuinely harmful messaging about mental health. The episode also shows how exhausting it can be for people around someone with depression. SpongeBob tries everything he can think of to help Squidward, but nothing works because you can't force someone out of clinical depression with activities and positive thinking. The failure of these attempts just makes both characters feel worse. What's really dark is that the episode never shows Squidward actually getting better. His happiness comes from destruction, which isn't sustainable or healthy. The underlying depression that caused the crisis is never addressed, suggesting this cycle will just repeat itself. Squidward is still fundamentally miserable. He's just found a temporarily satisfying way to express it. This episode deals with heavy themes like clinical depression, suicidal ideation, and mental health crises, but presents them as comedy rather than serious issues. The fact that it aired as children's entertainment is concerning, because it could teach kids that violent outbursts are normal responses to sadness and that people with depression just need to try harder to be happy. Now let's talk about an episode where a teacher literally tries to murder her student in revenge for a disability she caused. Demolition Doofus shows Mrs. Puff crossing every possible line and plotting actual homicide because she can't handle her own guilt. The episode starts with SpongeBob taking another driving test with Mrs. Puff, but this time something goes horribly wrong. SpongeBob crashes their boat multiple times, causing Mrs. Puff to inflate from stress, but then their boat goes airborne and crashes into a tower, causing a massive explosion. When Mrs. Puff wakes up in the hospital, she's been permanently changed by the accident. The doctor explains that Mrs. Puff's inflation sac was ruptured in the crash, meaning she'll never be able to puff again. This has literally taken away her defining characteristic as a pufferfish. She's lost a fundamental part of her identity and biology because of SpongeBob's reckless driving. When she asks if she'll ever be her old self again, the doctor says no, she'll never puff again. SpongeBob's reaction to permanently disabling his teacher is to make jokes about it. He suggests they should call her Mrs. Pop now, and starts laughing like her disability is funny. This is when Mrs. Puff snaps and tries to strangle him right there in the hospital. She has to be sedated with a needle because she's so enraged by his cruel response to her injury. Mrs. Puff's mental state deteriorates rapidly after the accident. She becomes obsessed with getting revenge on SpongeBob for ruining her life. When she sees Demolition Derby drivers being brought to the hospital as casualties, she gets an idea. She realizes she could enter SpongeBob in the Derby where he'd be accidentally killed by other drivers, giving her the perfect murder plot. The manipulation starts when Mrs. Puff convinces Captain Lutefisk to let SpongeBob compete in the Demolition Derby. She lies and says SpongeBob is a natural driver, knowing full well that he'll be destroyed by the professional drivers. She even helps create a scary identity for him called the Squish, setting him up to be targeted by the other competitors. What makes this particularly sick is how Mrs. Puff enjoys planning SpongeBob's death. She laughs maniacally while describing her plan and gets excited watching the violence at the Derby. When SpongeBob gets in his car, she's practically drooling with anticipation of seeing him get killed. This is sadistic pleasure in planning murder. The Demolition Derby itself is genuinely intense and violent. We see drivers called the Cruncher, Blowtorch, and Divin Bell Dale, who are clearly dangerous and aggressive. Mrs. Puff has thrown SpongeBob into an arena with people whose job is to destroy other cars. Knowing he has no experience or protection, she's counting on them to kill him for her. But SpongeBob's cartoon physics save him in ways that make Mrs. Puff increasingly frustrated. When the Cruncher tries to ram him, SpongeBob's body stretches and bounces the attacker into a wall. When Blowtorch attacks, SpongeBob accidentally runs over his face and escapes. Every near-death experience becomes a comedy moment, but Mrs. Puff is genuinely upset that her murder plot isn't working. Mrs. Puff's bloodlust gets more obvious as the derby continues. She starts screaming at the drivers to squash the Squish and gets angry when they fail to kill SpongeBob. When one driver asks why she wants him dead, she screams, "Why are you still alive?" showing that she's completely lost any pretense of this being an accident. She wants him dead and doesn't care who knows it. The situation escalates when Mrs. Puff decides to take matters into her own hands. She enters the Derby herself in a massive monster truck, wearing a helmet and calling herself the Huff. Her vehicle is specifically designed to be as destructive as possible, and she starts chasing SpongeBob around the arena trying to run him over personally. The chase sequence is genuinely terrifying because Mrs. Puff is completely unhinged. She's laughing maniacally while trying to crush SpongeBob with her truck, and we can see the murderous rage in her eyes. This isn't cartoon violence anymore. It's a realistic depiction of someone trying to commit vehicular homicide. She destroys everything in her path trying to get to him. The rampage continues when they crash through the Derby arena and start tearing through the town. Mrs. Puff pursues SpongeBob through the streets, destroying buildings and endangering innocent people in her quest for revenge. She doesn't care about collateral damage as long as she gets to kill the person who disabled her. They end up crashing through Mrs. Puff's own boating school, destroying the building where she's worked for years. But Mrs. Puff doesn't care about her career or livelihood anymore. All that matters is murdering SpongeBob. The destruction of her school is just acceptable collateral damage in her murder plot. The episode ends with both of them buried under the rubble of the collapsed building, but instead of this being treated as the serious attempted murder it actually was, Mrs. Puff suddenly inflates again and acts like everything is back to normal. She says yes, perfectly normal while sitting in the ruins of her destroyed workplace after trying to kill her student. What makes this episode genuinely disturbing is that Mrs. Puff's motivation is understandable. SpongeBob really did permanently disable her through his reckless behavior, and his cruel jokes about her condition are genuinely hurtful. But instead of dealing with these issues in a healthy way, she decides that murder is the appropriate response. The episode treats attempted murder as comedy and suggests that people who are hurt or disabled have the right to seek violent revenge. Mrs. Puff spends the entire episode plotting and attempting homicide, but this is presented as funny rather than deeply concerning behavior that should result in criminal charges. Demolition Doofus also normalizes the idea that teachers can abuse their authority to harm students who annoy them. Mrs. Puff uses her position to manipulate SpongeBob into a deadly situation, which is a massive betrayal of trust. The fact that she gets away with attempted murder and returns to teaching suggests that this kind of abuse is acceptable. The episode fails to address the real issues of disability, workplace injury, and how to handle anger in healthy ways. Instead of showing Mrs. Puff getting counseling or SpongeBob learning to be more sensitive, it just shows escalating violence that ends with everyone acting like nothing happened. That's a deeply disturbing message about how to handle serious conflicts. Now let's dive into an episode that abandons all logic and creates genuine nightmare fuel disguised as surreal comedy. SpongeBob in Random Land takes the characters into a dimension where reality breaks down completely, and the result is genuinely disturbing body horror and psychological terror. The episode starts normally enough with SpongeBob and Squidward getting a delivery order to a place called Random Land. Mr. Krabs explains that no delivery person has ever returned from there because it's a place where the laws of nature change randomly, and the people are all cuckoo. Instead of seeing this as a warning, Mr. Krabs sends them anyway because he wants the money. The first sign that something is wrong happens when they try to get to Random Land by walking randomly. SpongeBob starts moving in chaotic, unnatural ways, and suddenly they both disappear from normal reality and reappear somewhere else completely. They've been transported to a dimension where basic physics and logic don't exist. When they arrive in Random Land, the horror begins immediately. They land in a fountain and come out completely disfigured, with their body parts scrambled and distorted. Squidward tells SpongeBob he's hideous, and SpongeBob returns the compliment, but they shake themselves back to normal like this kind of body horror is just routine in this place. The environment itself is deeply unsettling. Random Land is filled with creatures that defy all natural laws, floating objects that behave impossibly, and characters that seem to exist in a constant state of chaos. The very air seems wrong, and even simple conversation becomes garbled as Squidward says things like, "sure is for that," and "put our grind to the nose stone," because the dimension is affecting their speech patterns. As they try to find their delivery address, they encounter increasingly disturbing sights. They see other delivery workers who have been trapped there, their minds clearly broken by the experience. Two delivery men bump into each other and literally merge into one being, showing that the dimension physically transforms people who stay too long. The body horror escalates when they meet various residents of Random Land. There's a creature shaped like the letter O that feels its stomach growl and spits out an egg containing SpongeBob and Squidward. A lady with two heads tries to dunk a Krabby Patty in Cocoa like a marshmallow, with actual marshmallows growing from her toes. These aren't cute cartoon characters, they're genuinely disturbing mutations. The most terrifying part comes when they encounter doors that lead to different realities. Squidward opens one door and sees mentally disfigured versions of himself, SpongeBob and Patrick. He opens another and sees an ugly, distorted version of himself. But the worst door shows what appears to be his normal room, which then turns to static and reveals a nightmarish version of Squidward with terrifying eyes that have ink dripping from them. This sequence is pure psychological horror. The doors represent different possible realities, and most of them are worse than the current one. The static transition suggests that even familiar places can become corrupted and dangerous. The ink dripping from Nightmare Squidward's eyes is genuinely creepy and looks like something from a horror movie rather than a children's cartoon. Squidward has a complete breakdown after seeing these nightmare versions of himself. He starts crying and screaming that the place is a nightmare and that no one ever returns. He's genuinely terrified and traumatized by what he's seen, and his fear is completely justified given the horrors around them. The episode gets even more surreal when they start chasing what they think is Mr. Krabs through different dimensions. They ride on dinosaurs with human heads, travel through black and white realities, and experience impossible physics, where up and down don't matter. Each transition brings new forms of body horror and reality distortion. The chase sequence becomes increasingly chaotic and violent. They're pursuing someone through realities where basic biology doesn't work, where creatures can be multiple things at once, and where the normal rules of existence are completely suspended. It's like watching people get pulled through a meat grinder of reality itself. When they finally escape Random Land, they discover that the Mr. Krabs they were following is actually a resident named Roger, who walked all the way from Random Land to complain about never getting his delivery. This means that the dimension's influence can extend beyond its borders, affecting the normal world in unpredictable ways. But the most disturbing element is how the episode ends. After they make the delivery, and Mr. Krabs realizes it was late, so he has to give it away for free, the strange lady from earlier appears and pops the screen like a balloon, turning everything white. Then a worm crawls around and forms a second head, smiling as the word "end" appears in its teeth. This ending suggests that Random Land's influence has infected the entire episode and possibly the real world. The fourth wall break where the screen literally pops implies that the chaos and horror of Random Land can break through into our reality. The two-headed worm with "end" in its teeth looks like something from a nightmare or creepypasta. What makes SpongeBob and Random Land genuinely disturbing is how it uses surreal humor to mask genuine horror elements. The body transformations, reality distortions, and psychological terror are played for laughs, but they're actually quite frightening when you think about what's happening. Characters are losing their physical integrity and sanity in a place that actively warps reality. The episode also deals with themes of being trapped in situations beyond your control. The delivery workers who never returned represent people who got lost in chaos and couldn't find their way back to normalcy. Squidward's terror is justified because he recognizes how dangerous and wrong everything is. The fact that this level of surreal horror was included in a children's show is concerning. While kids might find the randomness funny, the underlying imagery of body horror, reality distortion, and psychological breakdown is genuinely disturbing. The episode creates an atmosphere of dread and wrongness that's more suited to adult horror than family entertainment. Random Land represents a complete breakdown of the safe, predictable world that SpongeBob usually inhabits. It's a place where anything can happen, which sounds fun but actually becomes terrifying when you realize that includes genuinely horrible possibilities. The episode succeeds in creating a truly alien and hostile environment, but that success makes it deeply unsettling to watch. Next up is an episode that shows how friends can become torturers when they discover they can profit from someone's bodily functions. Ink Lemonade takes Patrick's stupidity and turns it into systematic abuse as he deliberately terrorizes Squidward to harvest his ink for a lemonade business. The episode starts with Patrick running a lemonade stand, but he doesn't actually have any lemons. When Squidward points this out and throws a rotten lemon at Patrick's eye, Patrick just puts a bandage on the lemon and adds it to his pitcher of water. Customers who drink this disgusting mixture get sick, but Patrick doesn't understand why people are complaining about his lemonade. The real horror begins when SpongeBob accidentally scares Patrick with a megaphone, causing Squidward to spray black ink from his nose into Patrick's pitcher. When SpongeBob and another customer taste the ink mixture, they have violent reactions, gasping and shrieking as their faces distort. But then they declare it delicious and want more, creating demand for Squidward's bodily fluids. Patrick immediately realizes he can make money by scaring Squidward into producing more ink, but he doesn't ask for consent or explain what he's doing. He just starts deliberately terrorizing Squidward to force his body to produce ink against his will. This turns Squidward into an unwilling victim whose bodily autonomy is completely violated for profit. The first torture session happens when Patrick knocks on Squidward's door and literally rips his own skin off to show his internal organs, creating a genuinely horrifying appearance. The sight of Patrick's exposed jaw, trachea, heart, lungs, and intestines is disturbing enough, but Patrick's willingness to mutilate himself just to scare Squidward shows how far he'll go for money. Squidward screams in terror at this grotesque sight and sprays ink into Patrick's pitcher, which is exactly what Patrick wanted. Patrick thanks him and walks away like nothing happened, leaving Squidward traumatized and confused about what just occurred. Patrick has essentially discovered that he can torture Squidward and harvest his fear response for profit. The abuse escalates when Patrick brings a giant red spider into Squidward's house to terrorize him further. Squidward's phobia of spiders causes him to climb the walls and ceiling in panic while spraying ink everywhere. Patrick follows him around with multiple pitchers, collecting every drop of ink that Squidward's terrified body produces. What makes this particularly sick is how Patrick orchestrates the torture. He doesn't just scare Squidward once and collect some ink, he systematically terrorizes him in multiple ways to maximize production. He uses the spider to chase Squidward around his own house, trapping him with his worst fears while harvesting his panic response. The business grows as more customers demand the black lemonade, creating pressure for Patrick to extract even more ink from Squidward. Patrick sets up an elaborate haunted house scenario inside Squidward's home, complete with spooky music, fake ghosts, and jump scares designed to keep Squidward in a constant state of terror. The psychological torture becomes more sophisticated as Patrick creates a fake baby scenario where he dresses up like a creepy infant and calls Squidward Dada. He's creating deeply unsettling psychological scenarios designed to maximize fear and ink production. The baby costume with Squidward's nose is particularly disturbing and feels like something from a horror movie. Squidward tries to escape his own house multiple times, but Patrick keeps trapping him in new terrifying scenarios. Patrick creates a fake version of the Krusty Krab where Puppet Squidward asks if he can help, creating existential horror about Squidward's future. Every room becomes a new source of terror as Patrick turns Squidward's entire life into a haunted house. The most disturbing part is how Patrick treats Squidward's obvious distress as a resource to be harvested rather than suffering to be stopped. Squidward is clearly having panic attacks and trauma responses, but Patrick just sees dollar signs. He's completely dehumanized Squidward and turned him into a machine that produces valuable fluids when tortured. The torture reaches its peak when Patrick's haunted house scenarios cause Squidward to run outside and encounter the long line of customers waiting for more black lemonade. Squidward realizes that his suffering has become a popular product and that people are literally lining up to consume the results of his torture. Squidward tries to capitalize on his own abuse by setting up his own inkstand, but his body has been so traumatized that he can't produce ink on command anymore. When customers demand their black lemonade, Squidward desperately tries to force himself to produce ink, but fails because his system is exhausted from the sustained abuse. The customers become violent when Squidward can't produce ink fast enough, grabbing him and making threats. This forces Squidward to spray ink in self-defense, but the customers are disgusted when they realize they're literally drinking someone's bodily fluids. They turn on both Patrick and Squidward, destroying the stand and running away in revulsion. The episode ends with SpongeBob and Patrick starting a new business selling cookies made with spider eggs, having learned nothing from the ink lemonade disaster. They've simply moved on to a new form of exploitation involving potentially dangerous ingredients, suggesting this cycle of abuse will continue with new victims. What makes ink lemonade genuinely disturbing is how it normalizes the exploitation of bodily functions for profit. Patrick discovers he can torture Squidward and literally sell his fear response to customers, turning trauma into a commodity. The fact that people are willing to pay for this makes the whole situation even more twisted. The episode also shows how quickly someone can become completely dehumanized when others see them as a source of profit. Patrick stops seeing Squidward as a person with feelings and starts seeing him as a resource to be exploited. Squidward's terror and pain become irrelevant as long as they produce marketable ink. The business model itself is horrifying because it requires sustained abuse to function. Patrick can't just scare Squidward once and have a product he needs to keep terrorizing him regularly to maintain his supply. This creates a system where Squidward's suffering becomes essential to other people's enjoyment. The fact that customers enjoy drinking something that's literally produced by someone's terror response is deeply concerning. They're consuming the physical manifestation of Squidward's fear and panic, which is both gross and psychologically disturbing. The episode treats this like a funny business idea rather than a form of torture. Ink Lemonade represents one of the darkest episodes in SpongeBob's history because it shows systematic abuse being treated as entrepreneurship. Patrick's willingness to torture his neighbor for money, combined with society's willingness to consume the products of that torture, creates a genuinely disturbing commentary on exploitation that's way too dark for children's television. Finally, let's examine an episode that shows how greed can turn someone into an animal abuser who exploits a pet's medical condition for profit. The scent of money takes Mr. Krabs' love of money and turns it into systematic torture of Gary, who suffers physically every time his body is used as a metal detector. The episode starts when SpongeBob bumps into Mr. Krabs' parked boat, and Gary's eyes start wiggling in a strange way. SpongeBob explains that when Gary does this, he usually finds change and demonstrates by having a penny fly onto Gary's shell. Mr. Krabs immediately sees dollar signs and asks SpongeBob to bring Gary to work, calling him a money-detecting Sneagle. SpongeBob initially refuses because he knows the process causes Gary big discomfort, showing that Gary's ability comes with genuine pain and suffering. But Mr. Krabs dismisses these concerns and convinces SpongeBob that Gary's talent is too amazing not to use. This sets up the central conflict where Gary's well-being is sacrificed for Mr. Krabs' greed. The exploitation begins immediately when Mr. Krabs starts using Gary like a metal detector around the Krusty Krab. Money flies from the floor onto Gary's shell, and Mr. Krabs takes it without any concern for how this affects Gary. When money comes from the order boat and even from a piece of gum that Mr. Krabs had been working on for months, it becomes clear that Mr. Krabs is systematically looting the restaurant using Gary's painful ability. The abuse escalates when customers notice their change being attracted to Gary and try to stop what's happening. Nat asks what Mr. Krabs is doing with his change, but Mr. Krabs claims that anything on the floor is fair game. When more customers complain about their money being stolen, Mr. Krabs' pants rip from the weight of all the coins he's collected, showing how much he's taken. Mr. Krabs becomes so obsessed with using Gary's ability that he starts taking him out of the restaurant to find money in other locations. They go to Goo Lagoon, where Gary is forced to detect buried money in the sand and coins from sunbathers. Mr. Krabs even holds Gary over sewer drains to collect money from the sewers, saying, "Dirty money spends just like the clean," while forcing Gary to endure disgusting conditions. The most disturbing part is how Mr. Krabs treats Gary throughout this process. He keeps calling Gary by wrong names like Jerry, Barry, and Harry, showing that he doesn't see Gary as an individual, but just as a tool for finding money. When Gary starts showing signs of distress and hides in his shell, Mr. Krabs just says, "That's a boy," like Gary's suffering is a good thing. Gary's condition gets worse as the day goes on. His eyes start wiggling more weakly and he begins hiding in his shell more often. Clear signs that the constant use of his ability is exhausting and hurting him. But Mr. Krabs ignores these warning signs and keeps pushing Gary to find more money even when Gary is clearly in distress. The situation reaches a breaking point when Gary falls asleep from exhaustion, but Mr. Krabs won't let him rest. He tells Gary there's no stopping because there's a laundromat that needs to be cleaned out and threatens him when Gary won't keep working. Only SpongeBob's arrival prevents Mr. Krabs from potentially hurting Gary for refusing to continue. SpongeBob tries to intervene multiple times throughout the day, but Mr. Krabs keeps making excuses and giving SpongeBob impossible tasks to keep him busy. He tells SpongeBob to rearrange wall rivets from smallest to largest, even though they're all the same size, just to get him out of the way. When that doesn't work, he tells SpongeBob to paint the entire Krusty Krab with a toothbrush. The abuse continues at the laundromat where Mr. Krabs uses Gary to steal change from washing machines. When a tough guy notices his change missing, Mr. Krabs runs away with Gary and the stolen money, making Gary an unwilling accomplice to theft. They end up at an arcade where Mr. Krabs sees all the coin buckets and becomes even more greedy and desperate. The climax comes when Mr. Krabs tries to use Gary to steal all the coins from the arcade games, but Gary's condition has deteriorated so much that his eyes are bloodshot and clicking like a railroad crossing. When SpongeBob confronts Mr. Krabs about using Gary to steal money, the argument causes Gary's overloaded system to explode, sending all the coins flying in a massive wave that buries Mr. Krabs. The aftermath shows Mr. Krabs in the hospital, injured by the very money he was so desperate to collect. The doctor explains that Gary had swallowed SpongeBob's Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy fridge magnet, which was causing the magnetic attraction. This means Gary was suffering from a medical condition the entire time, and Mr. Krabs was exploiting a sick animal for profit. The final insult comes when the hospital bill uses up all the money Mr. Krabs collected through Gary's suffering. Everything he put Gary through was for nothing, because the medical costs from his own injuries consume all his profits. Gary's pain and exhaustion bought Mr. Krabs exactly nothing in the end. What makes The Scent of Money particularly disturbing is how it shows the systematic exploitation of an animal's medical condition. Gary was suffering from having a powerful magnet in his digestive system, and Mr. Krabs used that suffering to steal money from people all over town. The episode also shows how greed can completely override empathy and basic decency. Mr. Krabs sees Gary in obvious distress multiple times, but chooses to ignore it because money is more important to him than an animal's well-being. He literally works Gary to the point of physical breakdown because stopping would cost him potential profits. The theft aspect makes everything worse because Mr. Krabs is using Gary's suffering to steal from innocent people. The customers at the Krusty Krab, the people at the beach, and the arcade players all lose money because Mr. Krabs is willing to exploit a sick animal to take what doesn't belong to him. The fact that Gary had a serious medical condition the whole time makes Mr. Krabs' behavior even more cruel. Gary needed veterinary care and treatment, not to be used as a tool for theft. Mr. Krabs' greed prevented Gary from getting help and instead turned his medical emergency into a business opportunity. The scent of money represents one of the clearest examples of animal abuse in SpongeBob's history. It shows systematic exploitation, ignoring obvious signs of distress, and using an animal's medical condition for profit. The fact that this is presented as comedy rather than the serious abuse it actually represents makes it genuinely disturbing to watch. The episode teaches children that it's acceptable to ignore animal suffering if you can profit from it, and that pets exist to be used rather than cared for. That's a deeply harmful message disguised as a story about Mr. Krabs being greedy, making it one of the most problematic episodes in the series. Now let's move on to the final stage of the iceberg, the Forbidden Depths. But don't forget to subscribe to our channel before we dive into the hidden part of the iceberg. Now let's finally talk about the Squidward suicide creepypasta. This disturbing horror story uses SpongeBob characters to tell a graphic tale of violence and death, yet somehow became one of the most infamous pieces of content connected to the beloved children's show. This nightmare started on 7chan's paranormal board in 2005 when an anonymous user posted what they claimed was a true story about working as a Nickelodeon intern. The post described witnessing an episode so disturbing that it traumatized everyone who saw it and led to police investigations. What makes this particularly sick is how the writer used SpongeBob, a show beloved by millions of children, as a vehicle for describing graphic child murder in excruciating detail. The story builds tension by starting normally. The supposed intern describes being in an editing room at Nickelodeon in 2005, watching what they thought was a normal episode called Fear of a Krabby Patty. When they saw a title card reading Squidward's suicide, they assumed it was just dark humor from the animators. But the episode quickly revealed itself to be something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The horror escalates when Squidward performs at a concert where the audience boos him with genuine hatred. Everyone in the crowd has hyper-realistic red eyes that look too detailed and disturbing for normal animation. Even SpongeBob is booing, which is completely against his character and immediately signals that something is very wrong. The episode then follows Squidward home, where he sits in his room crying in complete silence. The main event pushes far beyond anything that should exist in any medium, let alone something connected to children's entertainment. As Squidward cries, the episode starts flashing single frames of photographs showing actual dead children who have been brutally murdered. The story describes in graphic detail how these children were disemboweled, had their eyes gouged out, and were left naked and mutilated on roads while the killer photographed their work. The story presents them as real photographs of actual murdered children that somehow ended up spliced into a SpongeBob episode. The writer describes how the photos show children no older than 6 years old who have been tortured and killed, with the photographer's shadow visible in each shot, suggesting they were the murderer documenting their crimes. The climax involves Squidward bleeding from hyper-realistic eyes while screaming in agony before a deep voice commands him to kill himself. The episode then shows Squidward shooting himself in the head with a shotgun, complete with realistic blood and brain matter splattering across his room. The final shot shows his corpse with one eye dangling from his destroyed skull, staring blankly at the floor. The immediate aftermath describes how everyone in the room was traumatized, with people vomiting and running out when they realized the murder photos were actually frames from videos showing the killings happening. The story claims that Steven Hillenberg himself was called in and became angry when he saw the footage, and that police investigations were launched but found nothing. The most disturbing aspect is how the story ends with no explanation. The writer claims the file had been modified just 24 seconds before they watched it, but no one could determine how or by whom. This unexplained element made people question whether the story could be real, despite describing content that would be illegal to possess or distribute. The long-term impact shows how internet culture can normalize the most disturbing content imaginable. This story about child murder and suicide became so popular that it spawned an entire genre of similar creepypastas, countless video recreations, and even official acknowledgement from Nickelodeon when they referenced it in a real episode. The fact that descriptions of brutally murdered children became memes and entertainment shows how desensitized internet culture had become. Squidward's suicide represents the absolute worst of what happens when childhood nostalgia gets corrupted by genuinely disturbing content. It takes something innocent and beloved by children and uses it to describe the most heinous crimes imaginable, creating a piece of content that should never have been written, shared, or celebrated in any context. Moving on to the rabbit hole of lost episode theories, where SpongeBob fans have created an entire mythology around episodes that supposedly exist but were too disturbing, controversial, or dangerous to ever see the light of day. The whole lost episode phenomenon started gaining traction in the mid-2000s when the internet was becoming a breeding ground for urban legends and conspiracy theories. SpongeBob was at its peak popularity, and fans were hungry for any content they could get their hands on. This created the perfect environment for stories about secret episodes that Nickelodeon didn't want people to see. The success of the Squidward suicide creepypasta opened the floodgates for more lost episode stories. People realized they could take beloved cartoon characters and create horror stories around them that felt believable because they included specific production details and insider knowledge. The format became so popular that entire wikis were dedicated to cataloging these fictional lost episodes. The build-up to these theories often follows the same pattern. Someone claims to have worked at Nickelodeon, found a mysterious tape, or discovered footage through some other insider connection. They describe watching what they thought was a normal episode before it turned into something nightmarish. The stories always include enough technical details about animation and production to make them seem credible to people who don't know how cartoons are actually made. The main categories of lost episode theories include several distinct types. There are bootleg episodes with corrupted footage where the video becomes static and distorted while showing disturbing imagery. There are banned episodes that allegedly aired once before being pulled forever due to inappropriate content. There are unfinished episodes that were supposedly scrapped during production because they were too dark or violent for children. Some of the most famous theories include episodes where characters die in graphic ways, episodes that contain hidden messages or subliminal imagery, and episodes that were allegedly created by disgruntled employees trying to corrupt the show. People have created elaborate backstories about why these episodes exist, who made them, and what happened to the people who saw them. The immediate impact of these theories was that they created a whole subculture of people searching for lost media. Forums dedicated to finding these episodes popped up everywhere, with users sharing supposed screenshots, audio clips, and witness testimonies. People started making fake recreations of what these episodes might look like, which only fueled more speculation about whether the originals were real. The search for these episodes became obsessive for some fans. They would contact former Nickelodeon employees, dig through production archives, and analyze every piece of SpongeBob media they could find looking for evidence. The fact that some real deleted scenes and alternate versions of episodes actually exist made people believe that more extreme lost episodes could also be out there. The long-term repercussions show how internet culture can blur the line between fiction and reality. Many people genuinely believe these episodes exist, despite there being no credible evidence for any of them. The theories have become so embedded in SpongeBob fan culture that they're treated as real history rather than creative fiction. The phenomenon also demonstrates how nostalgia can be weaponized to create compelling horror content. By taking something pure and innocent like SpongeBob and suggesting there are hidden dark secrets behind it, these theories tap into people's fear that their childhood memories might be corrupted or fake. What makes these theories particularly insidious is how they've influenced real SpongeBob content. The show has referenced several of these fake episodes, and fans constantly speculate about whether new episodes contain hidden references to lost episode theories. The line between official content and fan-created mythology has become completely blurred. The lost episode theories represent a form of collective storytelling where an entire community works together to create believable fictional histories. They show how powerful the internet can be at spreading misinformation when that misinformation is entertaining enough that people want to believe it's true. Next up, we're looking at how SpongeBob became one of the most censored children's shows in the world, with different countries banning episodes, cutting scenes, and completely changing content based on their cultural standards and political concerns. SpongeBob's global reach meant it had to navigate wildly different cultural norms, religious beliefs, and government censorship policies across dozens of countries. What Nickelodeon thought was harmless cartoon content often clashed with local standards about violence, sexuality, religion, and even basic safety practices. The show that was designed to be universal entertainment for kids ended up becoming a case study in how cultural differences can turn innocent content into controversial material. The censorship wars began almost immediately when SpongeBob started airing internationally in the early 2000s. Different countries had completely different ideas about what was appropriate for children to watch. What Americans saw as silly cartoon violence, other cultures viewed as genuinely harmful content that could influence children's behavior. Religious countries objected to content that conflicted with their beliefs, while safety-conscious nations worried that cartoon antics might inspire dangerous real-world behavior. The scope of international censorship became truly staggering as the show spread worldwide. In Indonesia, entire episodes were banned for containing too much violence, with scenes of characters hitting each other or getting injured being completely removed. The UK developed an obsession with preventing seizures, slowing down, or cutting any scenes with flashing lights or rapid motion. Countries with large Muslim populations censored Sandy's bikini, either blurring it out or digitally adding clothing over her outfit. The most extreme censorship happened in countries where cultural and religious concerns overrode entertainment value entirely. In Persian-speaking regions, Sandy's bikini was replaced with full clothing, and scenes were awkwardly stretched or cropped to avoid showing any hint of her original outfit. Indonesia went so far as to ban episodes like Fools in April and Krabby Land for containing content they deemed too violent or inappropriate for children. Religious censorship created some of the most bizarre edits imaginable. In Arabic countries, wedding scenes were cut from episodes because they didn't align with religious marriage customs. References to Christmas were removed or replaced in Muslim countries, while episodes featuring love stories or romantic themes were either heavily edited or banned outright. Even innocent episodes like It's a SpongeBob Christmas were considered too religious for some regions. Safety concerns led to incredibly specific and sometimes ridiculous cuts. The UK censored scenes of characters handling hot grills, using knives, or doing anything that might be considered dangerous to imitate. Poland cut scenes of characters getting injured, while other countries removed any content involving fire, explosions, or characters getting hurt in ways that children might try to recreate at home. The violent censorship reached absurd levels in many countries. Indonesia banned Squid's Day Off just because SpongeBob tried to pull Mr. Krabs' claw from a sink. Poland originally cut the scene where Patrick stabs a jellyfish net through Squidward's bandaged hand, considering it too violent for children. Even simple slapstick comedy was deemed inappropriate, with countries removing scenes of characters bumping into each other or falling down. Cultural censorship often created the most confusing edits. In some Asian countries, any reference to gambling or luck was removed, even in episodes where characters were just playing innocent games. References to alcohol were cut even when characters were clearly drinking soda or other non-alcoholic beverages. Some countries went so far as to edit out any mention of dating or relationships, turning episodes about friendship into incomprehensible fragments. The religious censorship became particularly intensive in Islamic countries, where entire storylines had to be rewritten to avoid conflicts with religious law. The episode Band Geeks had the entire Sweet Victory performance cut in Iran and Italy because musical performances in cartoons were considered inappropriate. Any episode featuring characters in what could be interpreted as revealing clothing was either heavily edited or banned completely. Language censorship added another layer of complexity to international broadcasts. Words like stupid, idiot, and dumb were considered too harsh for children in many countries and were either dubbed over with milder alternatives or removed entirely. In the Philippines, these words were translated as useless or ugly because the original terms were considered strong language for children's television. The immediate aftermath of this massive censorship campaign was that different countries were essentially watching completely different versions of SpongeBob. Fans who traveled or accessed foreign broadcasts often discovered that episodes they thought they knew had entirely different scenes, dialogue, or even storylines depending on where they watched them. The show that was supposed to unite children worldwide through universal humor had been fractured into dozens of culturally specific versions. Some episodes became particularly controversial and faced widespread international bans. Midlife Crustacean was pulled from multiple countries due to the panty raid scene, which was seen as inappropriate sexual content in a children's show. Quarantined Crab was banned during the COVID-19 pandemic because its plot about a contagious illness was deemed insensitive during a global health crisis. The medical censorship during COVID-19 revealed how reactive censorship could be to current events. Episodes that had aired for years without problems suddenly became controversial because real-world circumstances made their content seem inappropriate. This showed how censorship could change based on temporary situations. The censorship also revealed uncomfortable truths about different countries' priorities and values. While some nations obsessed over preventing cartoon violence that could never actually hurt anyone, they often ignored real social issues affecting children. Countries that banned episodes for showing characters getting mildly injured often had serious problems with actual violence that received far less attention than cartoon censorship. The technological aspects of censorship became increasingly sophisticated over time. Instead of simply cutting scenes, censors started digitally altering content to remove offensive elements while trying to maintain narrative coherence. Sandy's bikini was digitally replaced with full clothing, violent scenes were edited to remove impact, and dialogue was changed to avoid controversial topics. The economic impact of censorship became significant as Nickelodeon had to create multiple versions of episodes for different markets. This increased production costs and complicated distribution, as the network had to maintain dozens of different edits for various countries. Some regions received so many cuts that episodes were significantly shorter than their original runtime. The long-term repercussions show how censorship can fundamentally change the nature of entertainment and art. SpongeBob went from being a cohesive creative vision to a fragmented collection of culturally sanitized content that varied dramatically depending on where you lived. The original creator's artistic intent was completely lost in many regions, replaced by whatever local censors thought was appropriate. The international censorship of SpongeBob also demonstrated how cultural imperialism works in reverse. While America often exports its values through media, other countries showed they could completely rewrite that media to fit their own standards. The result was that no one was actually watching the real SpongeBob anymore, just their country's version of what SpongeBob should be. What makes this particularly disturbing is how the censorship often made episodes less coherent or enjoyable without improving their supposed problems. Cutting violence often left plot holes, removing cultural references made episodes confusing, and editing safety concerns created jarring transitions that actually made the shows worse to watch. The cure became worse than the disease in many cases. The educational impact was also significant, as children in different countries were receiving completely different messages from the same show. While American kids might learn about friendship and perseverance, children in heavily censored regions might only see sanitized interactions that didn't reflect real human relationships or conflicts. The banned international versions of SpongeBob represent a form of cultural control where governments and organizations decided what children could see based on their own political and religious agendas rather than what was actually harmful or beneficial. The fact that a cartoon about a talking sponge became a battleground for cultural values shows how paranoid and controlling many societies have become about children's entertainment. The legacy of international censorship continues to affect how global media is produced today, with creators having to consider dozens of different cultural standards before creating content intended for worldwide distribution. SpongeBob's censorship history serves as a cautionary tale about how cultural sensitivity can become cultural oppression when taken to extremes. Finally, let's examine the darkest aspect of SpongeBob's world, the real-life trauma and abuse that happened behind the scenes at Nickelodeon, where the innocent facade of children's television hid genuinely disturbing workplace conditions and criminal behavior. The foundation for understanding Nickelodeon's toxic culture was laid decades before SpongeBob even existed. The network built its reputation on being the place where kids ruled and adults were either absent or incompetent. But this child-focused environment also created opportunities for predators and abusers who saw vulnerable young performers as easy targets. The very culture that made Nickelodeon successful also made it dangerous for the children who worked there. The build-up to widespread abuse was enabled by a system that prioritized entertainment value over child safety. Producers like Dan Schneider gained enormous power and influence over young actors, creating environments where inappropriate behavior could flourish unchecked. The network's focus on ratings and profits meant that successful producers were given free rein to run their sets however they wanted, with minimal oversight or accountability. The main revelations came through the documentary Quiet on Set: The Dark Side of Kids TV, which exposed systematic abuse at Nickelodeon throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Former child star Drake Bell came forward as the victim in a 2004 sexual abuse case involving dialogue coach Brian Peck, revealing that he had been abused by a Nickelodeon employee while working on shows that millions of children watched. The documentary also revealed inappropriate workplace behavior, including sexual content disguised as children's comedy and toxic treatment of young performers. The abuse extended far beyond individual incidents, revealing a culture where child actors were regularly exploited and mistreated. The documentary showed how young performers were put in sexually suggestive situations for comedy, subjected to inappropriate behavior from adult staff members, and forced to work in environments where their safety and well-being were secondary to entertainment value. Former cast members described feeling powerless to speak out because their careers depended on staying in the good graces of powerful producers. What makes this particularly relevant to SpongeBob is that the show was created and produced within this same toxic system. While Steven Hillenburg himself maintained a reputation for being protective of his creation and respectful toward his staff, the broader Nickelodeon environment where SpongeBob was made was infected with the same problems that affected other shows. The network that brought SpongeBob to life was simultaneously enabling abuse and exploitation of the children who appeared in its live-action content. The immediate aftermath of these revelations sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry and among fans who had grown up watching Nickelodeon. Many adults realized that their childhood entertainment had been produced in environments where real children were being harmed. The contrast between the innocent, joyful content on screen and the trauma happening behind the scenes created a profound sense of betrayal among viewers who had trusted the network with their childhood memories. The documentary also revealed how many powerful Hollywood figures had written letters of support for convicted child abuser Brian Peck, showing how the entertainment industry protects predators at the expense of victims. These letters had been sealed for decades, but the documentary's creators successfully petitioned to have them released, exposing the names of industry insiders who had supported a convicted child molester. One particularly disturbing aspect was how the abuse was often disguised as normal workplace behavior or creative content. The documentary showed clips from Nickelodeon shows that contained obviously inappropriate sexual innuendo and situations involving minors, but these were presented as innocent comedy for children. This pattern of normalizing inappropriate content made it easier for actual abuse to go undetected and unreported. The long-term repercussions include a fundamental reevaluation of how the entertainment industry treats child performers. The revelations have led to calls for stronger protections for minors working in entertainment, better oversight of adult-child interactions on sets, and more accountability for networks and producers who create content featuring children. For SpongeBob specifically, the revelations cast a shadow over the entire Nickelodeon brand and raised questions about what other problems might have existed in the production of beloved shows. While SpongeBob itself was animated and didn't involve child actors in the same way as live-action shows, it was still produced within the same corporate culture that enabled widespread abuse. The behind-the-scenes trauma at Nickelodeon represents a betrayal of the trust that parents and children placed in the network. The same company that promised to entertain and educate children was simultaneously exploiting and abusing the young performers who helped create that content. The fact that this abuse was happening while SpongeBob and other innocent shows were being produced shows how completely the network had failed in its responsibility to protect children. The most disturbing aspect is how long this abuse was allowed to continue and how many people within the industry knew about problems but failed to take action. The entertainment industry's culture of protecting powerful figures at the expense of vulnerable victims enabled predators to continue harming children for years while their colleagues looked the other way or actively covered up their crimes. If you enjoyed our video today, make sure to subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you in the next one.